every time the world almost ended. I don't know about you guys, but to me, it seems like doomsday scares are only becoming more and more common. Every day, we're either being told that the world is going to end or actively ending, and honestly, I'm just sick of it. If you're old enough to qualify for a senior's discount, then you might remember the Y2K scare of the year 2000. And if you're at least old enough to use this website, then you might remember the 2012 scare where the world was supposed to end as well. Regardless, all of these fake world-ending events got me thinking, what were genuine times in history when the world was its closest to ending? And well, my findings are this video. And as always, this video is only going to get crazier as it goes on. The Carrington event. It's a warm summer's night on August 28th, 1859. The sun had only just set, and this night was supposed to be like any other. Typically, after the sun sets, the sky only gets darker and darker. However, on this night, the sky was illuminated like never before. Eyewitnesses report that the sky appeared to be illuminated from the heavens, and others mentioned how the sky was a deep red as if it were engulfed by a wildfire. The night sky was so bright, in fact, that it actually awoke gold miners working in the Rocky Mountains, and they not only woke up, but began their workday in the middle of the night because they assumed the sun had risen. And it's reported that in New York, you could even read the newspaper at midnight due to how bright the night sky was. With this being said, it begs the question, what was in the night sky? Was it an asteroid? Was it a wildfire? Well, some of you might have already guessed that it was the Aurora Borealis. But these were no regular northern lights. The lights that were seen in the night sky on August 28th were visible for nearly a week. But it's not just the duration that's impressive. These lights were visible globally. Not only was the aurora visible from the North and South poles, but it was also visible through North America, South America, Cuba, Hawaii, Japan, China, and even New Zealand. But this aurora wasn't just a pretty light show. Although it was an interesting spectacle to witness at night, during the day, this aurora was wreaking havoc on the rather simple technology that existed, most notably telegraphs. Because of the geomagnetic-induced current from the electromagnetic field, telegraphs all across the world failed. But not only did they fail, they even shocked the operators. Telegraphs in some locations were sparking, breaking, and curiously, in some locations, telegraph operators were disconnecting their batteries from the telegraphs, and the telegraphs would still work without power. There's even a recorded conversation between two telegraph operators in Boston and Portland, who both disconnected the batteries from their telegraphs, but were still able to have a 2-hour-long conversation. And while this is interesting, it doesn't necessarily sound apocalyptic. And well, you'd be right. And that's because the Carrington event was caused by a massive solar flare, an event that is typically pretty harmless to humans. However, I wanted to mention it first in this video for two reasons. One, because it's the most tame entry on this list we're going to discuss, and two, because it's extremely interesting to theorize what would have happened if this solar storm happened in the modern day, a day where we rely so heavily on technology. And luckily, we don't have to speculate, because in June of 2013, a joint venture from researchers at Lloyd's of London and the Atmospheric and Environmental Research Committee used real data from the Carrington event to estimate the cost of a similar event in the modern day. And what they estimated was that if the Carrington event took place in 2013, it would have cost in the US alone $600 billion to $2.6 trillion in damages, which at the time would have ranged from roughly 3 to 15% of the annual GDP for the entire country. But numbers aside, what would this look like for humans? And the reality is scary. Most of the world would experience one of the biggest blackouts of all time. And this blackout alone would cause major issues, such as lack of communications, lack of transportation, lack of refrigeration, and so much more. Traffic lights would go down, hospitals would lose power, air traffic control would lose communication with planes, grocery stores would be empty, looting and riots would begin. Like, seriously, just imagine if the world lost electricity for even 2 weeks straight. Now imagine that going on for months, and maybe even years. So much would be going wrong. Besides just that, all banking and purchases would be unavailable, supply chains would basically completely halt, and the economy and likely civilization would be set back hundreds of years, if not eliminated entirely. And that's really not an exaggeration. If a Carrington event took place in the modern day, and it was not detected in advance and precautions were not taken in advance, then it's estimated that it would take up to a decade for all of the power grids that were affected by the solar storm to be fully restored. Now, before you get too scared about a whole modern day Carrington event, understand that with modern technology, we would be able to detect and plan for a Carrington level event to ensure that none of this happens. But before I give you too much hope, understand that some experts say that Carrington level events take place every roughly 150 years. And the last Carrington event was 160 years ago, meaning that to some, we could be overdue. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis is likely one of the most famous historical situations that had relatively minimal casualties, but could have potentially resulted in the most casualties ever recorded. I think it's safe to assume that most of us are familiar with the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, I will give a brief summary for those who are not so familiar. But beyond that, I want to focus not only on the entire situation, but on some of the more notable notable events that took place within the missile crisis that brought us inches from nuclear war between two of the world's largest superpowers. In October of 1962, the Soviet Union decided to secretly put nuclear missiles within Cuba. This secret operation was quickly exposed to the American government, and instantly concerns were high. Why are the Soviets breaking their agreement, and why are they putting nuclear warheads 90 miles away from our soil? Tensions were obviously at an all-time high, and slow communication and language barriers did not make the situation any easier. Once these secret missiles were exposed, the US government knew they had to respond, but they had to also be strategic because they knew the wrong response could result in nuclear war. It's kind of ironic because at this time, America already had nuclear warheads in Turkey off the coast of Russia. However, with the Soviets now having nukes off the coast of America, things were serious. And while I know that's an oversimplified explanation, it's kind of all I got for right now. But one interesting observation I'll make was that although tensions were extremely high, from my understanding, the leaders of both the United States and the Soviet Union did not want to go into a nuclear war, obviously because they both knew very well that this could result in the end of humanity. However, for the soldiers that were actually on site seeing their enemy directly in front of them, the urge to take shots and potentially start a war was a lot more appealing. And it's actually those situations that I want to talk about. During the entire Cuban Missile Crisis, the US President John F. Kennedy really just wanted to find the best way to have the missiles removed from Cuba peacefully. And the leader of the Soviet Union kind of just wanted to have their secret operation to be swept under the rug without repercussion. And obviously the result of the entire crisis was a mutual agreement to have nukes removed from Cuba and Turkey. However, what took place during the 13 days of the crisis left humanity inches from ceasing to exist. One notable incident that took place during the Cuban Missile Crisis happened on October 25th, 1962. It was late at night at the Duluth, Minnesota military base, when one of the guards noticed a suspicious figure climbing the fence into the military base. Obviously, the guard understood what was going on and realized that this military base was under attack. He quickly ran to his post and pulled a sabotage alarm. However, by some, the sabotage alarm was misunderstood and was actually taken as an alarm that activated a launch alert at Volk Field in Wisconsin. And this launch alert that was activated at Volk Field prompted the immediate deployment of nuclear-armed jets. With these nuclear-armed jets having their sights aimed at basically anything Soviet, if one of them were to have fired on Soviet or potentially even Cuban troops, America would have likely been met with nuclear retaliation, sparking the first ever nuclear war. Now here's the interesting part. After these alarms were set off, it was discovered that there was no person sabotaging or climbing into the military base at all. What the guard had noticed was actually a bear climbing the military base fence. And with that discovery, the launch of the nuclear-armed planes was canceled with only minutes to spare before pilots took off and the first nuclear war ever would have begun. This was only one example of numerous odd situations that took place during an extremely tense time where the relationship between the Soviet Union and America was razor thin. And even mistaking a bear on a military base in Minnesota could have caused the world to end. World War II. Okay, hear me out. I figured if we're gonna talk about the time we almost had a nuclear war, we should probably talk about the time there was literally nukes dropped within war. But I know I've talked about World War II a lot on this channel, so I'll keep this segment brief. I would say at this point, it's generally accepted that World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history. The entire 6-year war involved over 100 million people from 30 different countries, and battles literally took place on every continent beside Antarctica. And this entire brutal situation ended in 1945 when Germany surrendered to the Allied powers in May, and Japan was forced into submission in August when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on them. And well, once again, that's a massive oversimplification, you get the idea. World War II was hell on earth and literally killed an estimated 70 to 85 million, which was roughly 3% of the world's population at that time. So not only did the world almost end, but humanity lost 3% of its population, which is insane. But besides all of the crazy things that actually took place in World War II, let's discuss some of the things that almost took place. One of the most notable things that was bubbling was the development of nuclear bombs in the hands of the Nazis. That's right, after attacks on German soil, Hitler wanted to retaliate on American soil badly. He's even quoted saying that he wants to level all of New York and basically capture the rest of America. Hitler wanted so deeply to bring World War II to American soil that he was literally developing a bomber plane that could fly to America and back, and he just so happened at the same time to be developing a nuclear bomb as well. And unfortunately, the Nazis never got their hands on functioning nuclear bombs. I don't think it's hard to imagine what would have happened if they did, and the world that we live in today would look a lot different if it even still existed. And just imagine what would have happened if Japan decided to have nuclear retaliation against America. Japan had already successfully brought World War II to American soil, and if they happened to have had functional nukes and a death wish, then they too could have escalated World War II into global annihilation. But of course, during World War II, only America had successfully developed nukes, and as a result, they essentially told the entire world to sit down. And the nukes that were dropped on Japan is still a lesson that has not been forgotten to this day. And I actually think that it's those nukes that were dropped in World War II II that gave America and the Soviet Union so much reluctance to actually use the nukes that they were placing, which is a good thing. And thinking about these situations now, it's almost like comparing a balancing act to dominoes. Because in World War II, it seems like one domino hit another domino and the situation kept escalating and escalating until more and more countries and more deaths happened until at the very end, we saw nearly 100 million deaths, every continent, nearly every major country, and the most deadly weapon ever produced finally put a stop to the entire situation. However, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the entire situation was a balancing act trying to not go too far in either direction to actually trigger anything because the tensions and technology were already so high that one wrong move or one domino falling could have literally led to the end of the world. The Bonilla observation. This genuinely might be my favorite story in the entire video. In the year 1883, there was a Mexican astronomer named Jose Bonilla, and during a regular shift, Bonilla noticed something relatively obscure in his telescope. And for this reason, Bonilla took many photographs and wrote many notes of what he was seeing through his telescope. Interestingly, the photos that he took are regarded as some of the first images of unidentified flying objects, but trust me when I say this section has nothing to do with aliens. The objects that were seen through the telescope were basically impossible to decipher. Like, just look at this image on screen right now. Can you tell what that is? And for that reason, it was basically left to speculation. Bonilla ended up spending 2 days taking 447 ink photographs of the objects he was seeing through his telescope. And in the following years, Bonilla actually had his observations published in a French astronomy magazine. And French astronomers that observed Bonilla's photographs essentially said pretty confidently that there was either birds flying above the telescope or insects crawling on the telescope or something along that line. And roughly 40 years later, in 1920, Bonilla passed away. And while that is where Bonilla's story ends, that's not where the story of his observation ends. Because in October of 2011, 90 years after Bonilla had passed away, another Mexican astronomer decided to take a peek at some of Bonilla's photos. And the conclusion that he came to was not that he had seen geese or dust or bugs, but he actually had witnessed a comet exploding in space. And these modern-day Mexican astronomers were able to extrapolate that, assuming that Bonilla's timings and notes were correct when observing his UFO through his telescope, it's believed that the objects that he was witnessing were roughly 500 to 8,000 kilometers above Earth's surface and roughly 70 meters to 800 meters in length. And because Bonilla observed 447 objects in roughly 3 hours, and over 3,200 objects in a 25-hour period, the modern-day astronomers estimated that the original comet before it exploded had a mass that was roughly equivalent to 8 times of Halley's Comet. But they not only estimated the size of the original comet, but also said that if any of the fragments of this broken comet had impacted with the Earth, it would have likely been the equivalent of 3,275 Tunguska events in 2 days. And if that means nothing to you, then just understand that the Tunguska event was a massive explosion roughly 3 to 50 megatons in size that took place in Russia in 1908. That singular explosion alone was significant. But what these astronomers are claiming is that if these comet fragments that flew extremely close to the Earth had impacted with the Earth, it would have resulted in an explosion over 100,000 megatons in size, causing something they called, quote, probably an extinction event. And while the thought of this story is absolutely terrifying, I also kind of love the implications. There was a Mexican astronomer who saw something interesting and spent 2 days studying it. He submits his notes and photos for publishing in France, and they basically go, oh, you saw a bird, you saw a bug. He then dies, and 100 years later, other Mexican astronomers are like, oh, no, that's not a bird or a bug. That was basically the closest we've ever come to asteroid-induced human annihilation in, well, a long time. The Lake Toba eruption. Every situation we've discussed so far has occurred in roughly modern history. However, this is the turning point of the video where we get prehistoric, which is actually a good thing because the situations we're about to discuss are literally insane. And the Lake Toba super eruption is a great start to the second half of this list. Lake Toba, Indonesia is the modern day location of one of the most severe volcanic eruptions possibly in all of Earth's history. And it's believed by some that the result of this eruption was a trackable decline in human genetic variation. But let me take a step back. The Toba super eruption that we're discussing is actually the most recent in a series of eruptions that happened in the same volcano. This Toba eruption we're discussing took place only 74,000 years ago. And I say only because the eruption that took place before this one took place 1.2 million years ago, meaning that within the context, this one wasn't too long ago. Regardless, this eruption was significant. And as I mentioned, it was a super eruption. And what qualifies it as a super eruption was the fact that it had an estimated volcanic index of 8, making it the largest known explosive volcanic eruption in almost all of Earth's history. And I know that kind of just sounds like a lot of big numbers, but to kind of try to put this in a bit of context, in 2022, when the Hunga Tonga eruption took place, that volcanic eruption was estimated to have released 2 to 3 cubic kilometers of ash. And if you look at the pictures and videos and satellite imagery of that explosion, that is so much ash that was released, and it was truly a devastating event. However, if you think 2 to 3 cubic kilometers of ash is a lot, the Toba super eruption released 2,800 cubic kilometers of volcanic material. And this volcanic material had a major impact on the Earth's climate. Unsurprisingly, this volcanic eruption caused a volcanic winter, but this winter was rather significant, not only because it blocked out the sun's rays from entering the Earth's atmosphere, causing a global cooling by several degrees, but it's also believed that this period caused a 1,000-year cold period following the initial volcanic winter. Although that claim is disputed by some, and others say it would have only lasted 3 to 6 years before temperatures would have gotten within a few degrees of, once again, normal. Regardless if the cooling period was 6 years or 1,000 years, the effects were the same. Crops and vegetation across the world withered and died off, causing animals to die, and therefore massive famines among early human populations. And this volcanic winter isn't just speculation either. Core samples from both Greenland and Antarctica confirm a sharp cooling period at this exact time in history. But this is where things get really interesting, because some researchers believe that the Toba eruption was so significant that it's actually linked to a genetic bottleneck that took place during human evolution. And within this theory, it's believed that the global human population was drastically reduced to essentially a few thousand humans. That's it. Just imagine that, a global population of humans in the thousands. That is a crazy thought. And to some researchers, it's believed that this catastrophic event is the exact reason why there is a relatively low level of genetic variation in humans, because there was a time where so many humans were wiped out, and we all stem from a group of a few thousand humans roughly 75,000 years ago. And while this theory isn't necessarily proven or unproven, in the scientific world it's considered controversial, as the theory is making a bold claim and it's not quite proven yet, and there is some physical evidence to disprove it as well, meaning the conversation is still actively ongoing and relatively heated as well. But that's kind of beyond the scope of this video. The facts are this: 74,000 years ago, there was one of the biggest volcanic eruptions of all time, and it undoubtedly had a huge impact on human, animal, and vegetative life across the entire globe. And while the Toba super eruption is crazy to think about, it's even crazier to imagine what would have happened if the circumstances were just a bit worse, and if the Earth just got a little bit colder. Because if that were the case, potentially those last few thousand humans wouldn't have existed, and you and I would not be here to tell the story today. The Chicxulub impact. Okay, quickly before we get into this one, I realized how short we are for time, so if you guys are enjoying this video and want a part 2 with near world-ending events, please either leave a like or leave a comment telling me you want part 2. I'd be happy to make it, but for this video, I gotta kind of end it in this section. But with that being said, we're ending on a bang, literally. The Chicxulub impact is likely the most famous asteroid impact on Earth in the last billion years, let's say. If you're telling yourself, I've never heard of the Chicxulub impact or the Chicxulub crater, then allow me to speak in more broad terms. The Chicxulub impact or the Chicxulub crater is believed to be the impact site of the asteroid that killed 75% of all life on Earth. All plants, all animals, all vegetation, and this includes the death of all dinosaurs. I should reiterate that it's not the death of this life forms, it's the instant extinction of these life forms, meaning that likely 99.9% of all animals died, but 75% of all life forms were permanently extinct forever. But that's not even the craziest part. What's crazy is that for decades now, researchers have believed that dinosaurs must have been taken out by something instant and likely not from this world. And while this was unproven and unpopular in the scientific community, evidence was building. Specifically, a definitive layer of clay within the Earth's sedimentary rock that is dated to be roughly 66 million years old and is full of an element known as iridium. Interestingly, iridium is technically considered to be the most rare element in all of the Earth's crust, meaning that when it was found in levels that were over 100 times normal, there was something to be said there. And interestingly, iridium is more commonly found in asteroids in space than it is on Earth, further validating the theory that potentially there was a massive impact that took place on Earth, and during the impact, the asteroid vaporized, shooting all of this iridium into the atmosphere, settling across the entire globe in this layer of sedimentary rock. But still, this wasn't enough to satisfy the scientific community, and it wasn't until the 1970s when it was proven that there was an impact site hidden off the coast of Mexico, in the Yucatan Peninsula. And this took place when an oil rig was drilling off the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. What this company found when drilling wasn't oil, but actually shocked quartz, which can only be found in large amounts at an asteroid impact site, further validating the theory theory at the time that there was a massive impact that took place that also caused a global event. I could go really deep into the weeds about the scientific politics that took place during the entire discovery of the situation, but the result was this. It was eventually found out and confirmed that there is a massive impact site off the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The crater is roughly 200 kilometers in diameter and roughly 30 kilometers deep. It's believed that the asteroid was roughly 19 kilometers wide and approached Earth at a speed of 36,000 miles per hour. And the impact that took place 66 million years ago had results that life on Earth had likely never seen before. The direct impact itself is estimated to have an explosion equivalent to a bomb that was over 100 million megatons in size. And the result of this violent explosion was global earthquakes in magnitudes over 10, massive global tsunamis, massive global volcanic eruptions, massive global forest fires due to flaming debris falling essentially globally, and then global cooling caused by all of the debris that was sent into the atmosphere, blocking out any natural sunlight. Literally, just imagine the strongest forest fires, the strongest winds, the strongest storms, the strongest explosions, the strongest earthquakes, the strongest natural disasters, all happening all at once times 1 million. I am literally struggling to find the metaphors and words to try to convey the power and impact of this sheer event. And honestly, I feel like I'm doing a poor job, so just understand this. The Chicxulub impact was undoubtedly one of the most, if not the most, significant times in history when not only humanity, but the world was closest to ending. Crazy American conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. A couple weeks ago, I made a video about the craziest conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. And in that video, it was kind of concerning how many of these crazy conspiracies were either involving or done by the United States government. And in that video, I said if there was interest, I would make a video specifically focusing on conspiracy theories that involved the US government. And overwhelmingly, you guys demanded that video. And against my better judgment, I made it. So in this video, we're discussing crazy conspiracies that involve the US government. Let's begin. The Tuskegee study. There's a saying that goes, if something is free, then you're probably the product. And that is something that holds very true when it comes to the Tuskegee study. The Tuskegee study was a very disturbing and deceptive study that took place in Tuskegee, Alabama. The study specifically targeted black males and how having an untreated disease would affect them. If you're curious about what that disease may be, then perhaps the other name for this study may lend a hint. The Tuskegee study is also known as the Tuskegee syphilis study. Yeah. This study initially took place from 1929 to 1931 and had relatively innocent intentions. During this time, the Rosen World Fund, a fund that essentially promoted healthcare and education to poor African American farmers, specifically about sexually transmitted diseases. The goal of this initial study was to identify the southern counties in Alabama with the highest rates of syphilis among African American males. At this time, the goal was to simply find this location and find the people within this location that had syphilis and then treat them. Still seeming relatively innocent. This pursuit was successful, and they found that Macon County in Alabama had the highest rate of male syphilis, with over 35% of men being infected with syphilis. Although near the end of 1931 is where this all takes a very dark turn, as during this time the Great Depression was in full swing, and the Rosenwald Fund, which was looking to help the poor African American community, was running out of funding. It was at this point when the Public Health Service, a part of the United States government, approached the Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama to see if they would be willing to continue the study, specifically researching the effects of untreated syphilis in African American males. But they only proposed that they monitor these untreated people for 6 to 9 months to gather data and then at that point treat them fully. Remember this timeline, because we'll be referencing this later. The Tuskegee Institute agreed to do this research as they thought it was beneficial, not only for their local population, but for all Americans. And it was shortly after, in 1932, when the study began. The study began with 600 men being enrolled into the study. 399 of these men had syphilis, 201 of these men did not. Things already take a dark turn here, as all 600 of these men were more or less kept in the dark about what this study exactly was about, and they were really only being told that they were getting free healthcare, something that was hard to come by and an appetizing offer for anybody suffering from any sort of disease. Right? Not only did the government say that they were going to give them free healthcare, they also said that they were going to treat these men of their bad blood, which isn't really a medical condition. It was more or less of a local blanket term that just described general illness. Most of them weren't even necessarily diseases themselves, but symptoms, such as fatigue, body pains, anemia, and even undiagnosed syphilis symptoms as well. These 600 men were specifically promised free medical exams, meals covered by the government, and even burial insurance in case they died during the study. That alone should have seemed like a red flag, but at this time it seemed like a deal that was too good to be true, which is potentially another red flag. So consider that 2 red flags. But back to the point. For the men in the study who were confirmed to have syphilis, the government didn't tell them about their diagnosis, and they didn't even give them any treatment either. Now, at this point, you might be asking, why didn't the government simply find people that they knew had syphilis and then simply request that they have the ability to monitor them? These people already had syphilis, and the US government was willing to incentivize them, so why not inform them about the data that you're collecting? The government claimed they took a deceptive path because it was the only way that these men would have stayed in the study, and for the study to work, they needed to be closely monitored consistently over time. But it's heavily suspected that this deception was based on a lack of respect, both because of racial and economic prejudice. Specifically because the study only involved black men, all of which who were poor farmers, which meant they had limited resources and almost no education as well too. And by limited education, I mean very limited, like fully illiterate. So if you're an educated and prejudiced doctor during this time, why would you give these people any real information? Just keep them in the dark. They don't know any better, right? That doesn't sound ethical to me, but I suppose that was their mindset. So at this point, you may be thinking, sure, okay, the US government wasn't fully upfront and maybe wasn't even respectful to these people that they were studying, but so what? It's not like they gave these people syphilis. These people had syphilis. All they were doing was collecting data. And while I personally would say that there is a ton of ethical issues within that already, that is not the worst part about this study. That is only the beginning of this study. After the initial 9 months that this study was supposed to go on, they decided to extend the study and extend it again. And in 1934, the first major paper about the study of untreated syphilis was made public. And if you're thinking that now that there's a paper and they can end the study and finally treat these men, you're unfortunately mistaken. And it was at this point when the study was extended once again. And there was even a push from the medical community not to treat these men, but to actually prevent these men from getting treatment so they could see the prolonged effects of syphilis. And this is where we get to the darkest part of this study. The study actually went on for 40 years. And for a majority of that 40-year period, there was actually an extremely effective and safe treatment available. That being penicillin, which was first used to treat infections in 1930, and by 1945, it was accepted as a proper treatment for syphilis. But of course, these men were kept in the dark about that, and were never offered it or even informed about it. And the government simply just decided to watch these men wither away, to see how this infection affected daily life over an extremely long period of time. By the end of the study, it was estimated that 128 of the men in the study died directly from the syphilis that they had. 40 of the men in this study also infected their wives, and 19 of these men had children that were born with syphilis. Those numbers especially are extremely disheartening because those people didn't even sign up for this deceptive study. They were simply the unintentional victim of the unintentional victim. And a lot of these deaths and infections could have easily been prevented by treating these people like they planned on doing. But instead, they decided to simply withhold treatment and monitor them for 40 years. Something that I think any reasonable person would agree is unethical and honestly horrible. Medical studies require consent, and the patients in the study need to be fully informed of the risks and also treatments available, and they need to be treated with respect. And with the Tuskegee study, none of those measures were taken, and it's truly a dark and shameful part of American medical history. But there is a silver lining to this story, as on July 25th, 1972, a journalist named Jean Heller broke the story about the horrific study that had been going on for the last 40 years. And with this news breaking, the government then decided that this study was ethically unjustified, and that also meant that it was immediately canceled. And the following year, there was actually a class action lawsuit that was filed on behalf of these men who were unknowingly a part of the study, and they did end up winning $9.5 million in 1973 money. So keep in mind, it's adjusted for inflation, it's around $50 million today. I'm sure for some, this money was extremely helpful and went a long way, but many of the participants never even knew that they were part of a study, never saw this money, and simply died because they didn't know what they signed up for. And even if you did live to get part of this settlement, not only is your body worse for wear for never getting treatment for a disease that they knew you had, but you also likely have no trust in the government, as they just spent the last 40 years treating you like a lab rat, and the few dollars that they were forced to throw at you only feels like too little too late. So yeah, the Tuskegee study started by simply trying to identify counties with the highest syphilis population to begin treatment, and ended with a 40-year study that completely violated not only the human rights of the participants, or should I say victims, but also the medical system as a whole. And as upsetting and disturbing as the story is, at least there was some sort of closure associated with it. This is only the first entry on this list, and we have lots more to cover. The Watergate scandal. When I first heard the name of this conspiracy theory or situation, I was convinced that it had something to do with the US government putting something in the water. But as you may know, that's not the case at all. And interestingly, this scandal is also the reason why a lot of other scandals have gate in their name, such as Deflategate, Elsagate, and a lot of other scandals that range from morbid to disturbing. So let's give a bit of context before we get into the details of this Watergate. Richard Nixon was the 37th president of the United States. He was an author, a lawyer, and a career politician. But in 1974, his presidency was cut short as he resigned for reasons that involve the Watergate scandal. This entire scandal is interesting and kind of two-sided because there is the initial acts that took place, and then there is the reaction to the exposure of the initial actions. And if you're already confused, don't worry, because I'm going to lay it out simply as possible. This entire situation begins with Richard Nixon being paranoid that he was not going to win a re-election, something that he feared deeply and was willing to do anything to avoid. This included harassing opposing journalists, politicians, and even celebrities who could potentially influence his re-election in a negative way. And he and his administration would harass them by abusing government power in ways such as auditing them and even getting them involved in strange legal disputes and more. But that's only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the situation. Prior to the 1972 election, the election that Nixon was so fearful of losing, a group of Nixon's associated formed the Creeps. Creeps meaning the Committee to Re-elect the President. An odd and kind of fitting name. This rather elusive group went to some extreme and even illegal measures to ensure that their goal was met. One of their biggest efforts was collecting information on the opposing party, the Democratic Party. And this is where we get to Watergate. This group of creeps were approved to break into and plant listening devices into the Democratic National Committee headquarters, which just so happened to be based in the Watergate office building in Washington, D.C. The group figured that if they could break into their offices and collect data secretly, they could find some dirt and use it against them to make sure that they win the 1972 election. The first time these creeps broke into the office, the mission was successful. However, on their second attempt, all 5 of these men were caught. And this is where the plot thickens. Because nobody knew who these men were, what their motivation was, and what their goal was. All they knew is that there was 5 spies breaking into the Democratic Party's headquarters. Although it's not hard to think of who may have potentially ordered this attack. The FBI began to look deeply into this case to find who exactly was involved and what their motivation and goal was. It was at this point, coincidentally, when Richard Nixon would instruct the CIA to tell the FBI to halt all further investigation on this entire scandal, or at least the finances involved behind the scandal. They were still going to investigate these men, but the funding investigation was blocked. Obviously, this entire situation sparked public outrage, and there was a lot of finger pointing at the Republican Party, specifically at the president himself. And although he and his party strictly denied any involvement or awareness of this essentially spy operation, information was flowing in and the house of cards was crumbling. One of the early pieces of evidence that pointed towards Nixon was the fact that one of these men who conducted this robbery was actually a Republican aide. And on top of that, they had an informant who was feeding them information directly connecting these burglars to Richard Nixon himself. And I swear I'm not even making it up, this informant or whistleblower went by the alias of Deep Throat. Shout out Deep Throat for the information. I feel like if you called the government right now and told them you had information, but you wanted to go by the name Deep Throat, you'd probably get hung up on, but that's just me. Now, despite all of this media attention and this obviously odd situation going on, Nixon did obviously win the election in 1972. However, that was short-lived. The following year in 1973, 4 of Nixon's top aides lost their job because they were involved directly in the cover-up. Through months and months of consistent investigations, there was only more and more dots being connected and lines being drawn directly back to Richard Nixon from these burglars and from this entire scandal. And while everything was still relatively unconfirmed, it became more and more plausible that Richard Nixon not only knew about this situation, but was also directly involved. And it was at this point as well when Richard Nixon's own assistant broke the news that Richard Nixon had installed spy devices all around the White House. And while his intentions aren't fully known, I would assume he did this to benefit himself, and unfortunately for him, these recording devices actually became his downfall, as they were able to prove his involvement. When Nixon's assistant broke the news in court that these devices were installed, the government instantly subpoenaed these devices to hear the recordings that he had captured. And of course, Nixon honored the subpoena and handed over these recording devices, right? No, obviously not. He not only denied to hand them over, but he also exercised an executive privilege, stating that the president should have some right to privacy, which obviously isn't what this was about at all. Eventually, these tapes were handed over, and after thoroughly being reviewed, it was confirmed that Richard Nixon knew exactly what was going on and was even providing hush money to these creeps. The president had two options: resign or be impeached. And as we know, on August 8th, 1974, he resigned as the United States president. This entire situation put people in jail, changed laws, and also changed US politics forever, as it was the first ever resignation of a president in the history of the United States. This conspiracy or scandal may not seem extremely shocking at this point, because I feel like nowadays trust in the government is at an all-time low, but that wasn't always the case, and there was a point in time when people had trust and respect for the powers that be and believed that they had integrity. This situation is undeniably bad, as it's a blatant abuse of power, and is a demonstration of a president fighting dirty for his own gain. And while justice was served and there was a happy ending to this story, the situation really only exposed likely something that was already going on. So yeah, the president wanted to maintain his power, did some shady things to collect some information to win the presidency, but what's considered worst of all is the fact that he not only denied and lied about the situation, but also used executive orders to prevent the truth from being revealed. Regardless, people in these high positions of power should be held to a high standard, and integrity and honesty should come first. And I hope someday we can return to that. But yeah, let's keep going. Project MKUltra. MKUltra is one of the most notorious and disturbing covert operations in all of US history. And it's for that reason that I'm going to keep this section pretty brief and try my best to make sure that I really only focus on information that you may not have heard yet if you're already familiar. This entire conspiracy theory had one single goal: to explore the methods of mind control and behavioral manipulation in humans. The reason this operation even started was because after the Korean War, American prisoners of war who were being returned home seemed to have been brainwashed, as they were consistently repeating what they believed to be communist propaganda. To the American government, this was very concerning, because they assumed this had to be the result of brainwashing from their communist opposition, which meant that if these communists had mind control techniques that the Americans didn't, then they had an advantage over America. And obviously this meant that they needed to develop their own mind control techniques, or at least explore how they would go about it. Already, we're on a pretty disturbing note, but this really does only get worse from here. It was after this discovery when the CIA, which was relatively new at the time, was given $25 million to perform psychiatric experiments on humans. At the time, this was the most hidden and secretive project that the CIA and the US government as a whole was performing. And it'll become pretty obvious why when we get into the details. The government was finding patients at psychiatric hospitals, prisoners from federal prisons, and even random members of the public. And what they would do is dose them with drugs without their awareness and then do experiments on them to see how the drugs affected them. One of the most interesting and notable operations in MKUltra was an operation known as Operation Midnight Climax, which has an oddly fitting name, and essentially consisted of the US government building safe houses. And what these safe houses were essentially fake plant houses where US government funded prostitutes would lure men into these houses and then dose them with LSD where they were being observed, typically behind a two-way mirror in that very safe house. In the last section, we talked about creeps in the government, but this brings it to a whole nother level. Not only were they paying prostitutes to lure men to essentially trapped houses, they would also dose them with drugs without their consent and experiment on them. But that's still only the tip of the iceberg. Another interesting thing that they did was hosting LSD parties, which was essentially a party where music was played and LSD was unknowingly given to the participants of this party. And these scientists would simply observe these people on LSD to see how they would react. And it's believed that these ongoing tests were actually a precursor to the hippie movement, or at least part of it, which is interesting. But MKUltra wasn't just prostitutes and partying. There was a lot of medical mismanagement, most famously at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Canada, where patients with relatively minor ailments would be taken advantage of and experimented on with aggressive drug cocktails. The main doctor at this institute, known as Dr. Cameron, pursued a concept that he called depatterning, and this concept and practice was truly evil. The goal of this practice was to reduce patients to an infantile psychological state, essentially giving an adult the mind of a child. And the point of bringing people to the state was so that the government could take advantage of this extremely vulnerable position and from that point rebuild their mind, giving them an entirely new psyche. thought process, mindset, and belief system to essentially control this person fully. Besides dosing these people with drugs, they would also put these people into comas and play messages over and over again until they sunk deep into the person's subconscious. And they even performed electroshock therapy and other forms of extreme therapy on these people as well. Disturbingly, this entire project went on for 20 years, from 1953 to 1973. And while it's not known the true number of people that were unknowingly experimented on by the US government in this 20-year period, it's likely safe to assume that there was hundreds, if not thousands, of victims of this disturbing study, many of which who were simply never the same, for reasons that they would never understand why. If you're experienced with drugs, then you likely understand how bad it is to have a bad trip, and you likely understand how detrimental it could be for someone who's never had a psychedelic experience to have an unknowing dose put upon them. That experience, for many, is likely completely mind-altering and also extremely terrifying, and it's quite disturbing how many people this had happened to. Although, once again, there is some sort of happy ending, I suppose, as in 1973, the operation was closed, once again by a whistleblower, although this time the whistleblower's name wasn't Deep Throat. His name was actually 69 Lord. I'm just joking. His name was John Marks, and he wrote a book named The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, where he exposed most of the operation. And at that point, after this information had been exposed, congressional hearings began to investigate what was really going on. And it was through those hearings where the CIA not only admitted that the operation existed, but they also were forced to admit what they were doing. To this day, there has been no class action lawsuit, no apology, nothing. And the children of some of these victims are still pursuing legal action against the institutes that they deem responsible. And personally, I hope justice is truly served, as awareness and exposure is one thing, but justice goes beyond just that. It's so ironic that after the Korean War, the US government publicly exposed and shamed these communist countries for their mind control techniques and how they could possibly brainwash prisoners of war and torture them. But almost immediately after giving a speech about how horrible these things are, they then begin not only researching their own methods of doing the exact same thing, but they go about it in likely the worst way possible. And Project MKUltra is a massive example of the US government breaking moral, ethical, and legal laws in their own self-interest, and it's one that people have not forgotten, nor should they ever. What do you guys think? Feel free to let me know in the comments. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video was made because of your overwhelming interest and support in the comments of the last video. So I just quickly wanted to make the same offer again. If you guys liked this video and would like me to make a part 2 about crazy conspiracies that the US government has been involved in, then please leave a comment telling me that you want part 2. I try to read as many comments as possible, and I take your guys' suggestions seriously. So yeah, I thought I'd just mention that quickly. But without further ado, let's get to the last entry of this list, the Iran-Contra affair. The US is still very much in a Cold War against Russia, and is still very much so anti-communist. And it was at this time when the president, Ronald Reagan, promised to support anti-communist insurgencies around the world. Meaning that if you were a country that was currently dealing with a potential rise in communism or the threat of communism, the US had your back to make sure that that wasn't a problem. Typically by providing arms, or at the very least, training. Reagan was particularly interested in a group known as the Contras, and this group was at war with another group within Nicaragua, known as the Sandinistas. The biggest difference between these two groups was the fact that the Sandinistas was a communist group, and they were backed by Cuba. The president, Ronald Reagan, saw the Contras as a noble force, and even equated them to being similar to the founding fathers as they were fighting for freedom. Now this is where things begin to get sticky. The Contras were funding their war primarily through the drug trade, and because of this, the American government actually passed an amendment known as the Boland Amendment, preventing the US government from providing the Contras with any support due to their involvement in the drug trade. So far, this is pretty straightforward and seems reasonable enough. However, it was at this point when Ronald Reagan decided that he didn't want to follow this amendment and continued to support the Contras regardless of the amendment. And how they did this is a bit confusing, as where they went next was Iran. At the time, in 1985, Iran had 7 American hostages that they were keeping in Lebanon, and Reagan wanted to do everything he could to make sure that these hostages came home alive. It was at this point when the government made a deal. The US government, with Reagan's approval, agreed to give Iran weapons in exchange for the release of the hostages. It's important to note that this was all happening behind closed doors, because publicly, Reagan was saying that he would not negotiate with terrorists, and there was even a trade embargo currently going on with Iran at the time. But that's still only where things begin, as the US government technically budgeted $30 million to go to Iran for this terrorist negotiation, although it was shortly after exposed that only $12 million of this $30 million actually went to Iran, and the remaining 18 million actually went to support the Contras, a group that the US government was not allowed to support. This is a bit of a double whammy because not only was the government negotiating with terrorists, something that they said they would not be doing, but they were also supporting a group that they were not allowed to support. And this was all exposed by a Lebanese journalist in 1986. And the fallout of this is where we truly see the impact of the entire situation. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who was in charge of most of these operations, came clean about his involvement and said that he knew it happened, he was part of it, and he also admitted that Reagan knew about all of it. This testimony from the colonel and pressure from journalists caused investigations to be launched against Reagan, not just at the time, but for the entirety of his presidency from that point on. And after these investigations, it was ruled that Reagan's involvement was more or less benign and was simply due to a lack of oversight, and because of this, he was not implicated directly, meaning he wasn't in trouble. At least until 1987 when Reagan finally testified on this entire matter. And while these hearings went on for 41 days and were publicly televised, Reagan would still not face any consequences. However, that wasn't the case for everybody. 12 people involved in this conspiracy were charged and found guilty. Those people being Robert McFarlane, Colonel Oliver North, 4 CIA officers, 5 government contractors, and Reagan's national security advisor, John Poindexter. Undoubtedly, this entire situation stained Reagan's image as a president and as an honest man. However, surprisingly, he was never impeached, never resigned, and actually left office with one of the highest approval ratings in US history, which to me either seems that people were uninformed about the situation or simply agreed with what happened, although it wasn't legal. Not only did it expose a level of distrust for the government, like in Watergate, but it also resulted in the US government literally giving an opposing terrorist organization $12 million out of a hypothetical $30 million that was supposed to be given to them, which I think a lot of people would consider to be a conflict of interest. And while obviously getting hostages home is important, giving them a proposed $30 million of weaponry seems a bit counterintuitive. Combine that to secretly funneling money to an organization that is currently trying to overthrow the Nicaraguan government that is funded by the drug trade, that's an entirely different can of worms as well too. And whether or not you think these actions were justified or moral, that's a decision that you have to make for yourself. But the point is the fact that the government was lying directly to the face of the people and doing things that they likely would have not voted towards or supported, which some would consider to be unlawful, unmoral, and unethical. And if the person you're supposed to trust is saying one thing to your face and then behind closed doors doing essentially the exact opposite, it's not a good look for the trust and faith in the institution that you're running. And I suppose with that, I do want to make a quick point that although this video is focusing on negative things that the US government has done and been involved with, I don't want you leaving this video with a huge doom and gloom mentality. And I think it's important to note that the government is simply a group of people, and people are dumb for the most part and self-interested. And for that reason, the government is going to reflect the people that it's made up of. That doesn't excuse them of any of its responsibility, although it's important to note that the government isn't this otherworldly thing that is perfect. It's really not. It's literally just people. And ideally, we'd have great people in there looking out for other people, but obviously that's not always the case. But with that being said, I think the point of this video and the mindset I'd like you to leave this video with is not to say that the US government or any particular government is evil and horrible and out to get you. I think it's important to note and be aware of times where the government or any institution has done horrible things, be aware of them, hold them accountable, and also do everything in our power to learn from them and prevent them from ever happening again. And the more things that we're able to expose and have out in the open, the more we're going to be able to see the signs in the future and prevent further negative things from happening. But maybe I'm just too optimistic. Let me know what you guys think. The deadliest weapons in every time period. The weapons humans have used throughout history are possibly one of the most important factors in human history itself. Mainly because these weapons have allowed humanity to not only survive, but evolve and progress in a world where we have little to no physical advantage amongst larger predators. People like you and me are soft and squishy. Although, give us a rock, a stick, or a nuclear bomb, and we become a lot more threatening. And it's because of this that throughout the course of history, we have seen not only an evolution of humanity, but also an evolution of the weaponry used by humans. And it's for this reason that in some cases, entire time periods are literally defined by the material used to create weapons. Which is why in this video, I'm going to be discussing the deadliest, most impactful, and most interesting weapons from every era of human history. Let's begin. The Stone Age. Imagine right now, you were teleported from off your couch or toilet into prehistoric times in the African savannah. What would be the first thing you would grab to defend yourself from natural predators and other human tribes? Would it be a rock, a stick, Well, if you said any of those options, you are officially as smart as our ancient ancestors. Starting with not only the deadliest, but possibly the first weapon ever made by humanity, we have the spear. And the spear very likely predates modern-day humans. You see, humans as we exist today are known as Homo sapiens, and we've existed in this form for roughly 300,000 years. However, what came before Homo sapiens was a group of ancient hominids known as Homo heidelbergensis, who were believed to roam this earth roughly 400,000 years before Homo sapiens even came along. Archaeological evidence suggests that these ancient early humans were using the most simple form of what we would now call a spear. What was found at certain dig sites in Germany were sticks that literally just had one side shaved into a point, and it's believed that this tool was crucial for hunting and defending off predators. Now, while a pointy stick may not seem like the deadliest weapon in the world, when it is literally the only weapon you have access to, the difference between trying to defend yourself with something that can inflict penetrating damage as well as give you a huge range advantage is, at least in the context of the time, a huge technological advancement that definitely made these very early humans a lot deadlier. Following the pointed sticks of pre-Homo sapien humans, we still find ourselves using spears, although the way we make spears has advanced, and the variety of weapons and tools we have in our arsenal has grown. One of the biggest advancements in spear technology in the Stone Age was the introduction of composite spears, which essentially just means spears made of different materials. And in the case of the Stone Age, what this looks like is a stick with either a sharpened rock or piece of bone on the end of it, attached with plant fibers, or in some cases, animal fibers. These upgraded spears were a lot more durable and had the opportunity to cause a lot more damage on prey. However, while spears did eventually end up becoming throwing weapons, it's believed that these early versions of composite spears were likely only used for jabbing simply because they were likely too lopsided to fly effectively through the air. Although that's something that historians and archaeologists are still debating. But what we do know is that when humans finally discovered that you could attach a stick to a rock, they didn't stop at making spears. During the Stone Age, humans made a plethora of early tools using only, of course, stone and wood, with another notable example being the hand axe. The construction method was similar to the spear, although the ingredients were different. The rocks used as the axe blade were typically larger and triangular, and the handle was typically shorter and wider. And these axes could be used for a plethora of things. Now, even though these few weapons we've discussed so far are undoubtedly era-defining, with the Stone Age literally being named after stone tools and weapons, there are two more inventions, both in a new category of weapon that came later in the Stone Age that I think are very much so worth mentioning. The first being the bow and arrow. Interestingly, the exact origins of the bow and arrow are not known. Although the oldest archaeological evidence we have of bow and arrows right now date all the way back to 69,000 BC, or 71,000 years ago. And while bows and arrows are very likely older than that, that's simply the oldest recorded archaeological evidence of a bow we've found so far. And with early Stone Age bows being made of extremely simple and biodegradable materials, we're honestly even lucky to find evidence of bows and arrows being that old. Regardless, if I had to estimate one weapon on this entire list to potentially be the deadliest weapon in all of human history, I would argue the bow and arrow is a strong contender for that title. Simply because it's one of the oldest weapons ever, it's been utilized by basically every culture in almost every era of history. But without getting too far ahead of ourselves, the invention of the bow and arrow is not only an era-defining weapon, but a species-defining weapon. And I think the fact that this weapon is still used today by humans is only proof of that. But we're not done yet. Since the Stone Age typically doesn't get this much love, I wanted to discuss one more cool weapon that also fits in the same category as bows and arrows. That category, of course, being projectiles. You see, we had early hominids creating the first iteration of the spear, essentially just sharpened sticks. And then we saw early Homo sapiens attach stones to sticks. And as time went on, we saw Homo sapiens develop, turning jabbing spears into throwing spears. And once throwing spears were commonplace, we saw another iteration on top of that, a weapon that is now known as the atlat, or spear thrower in simple terms. This invention, much like the bow and arrow, gave humans a huge leg up when they were hunting, because no longer did humans have to get up close and personal with their prey to thrust a spear into them. They could now literally use a stick attached to their spear to throw the spear with extra force and extra leverage, effectively injuring and killing animals at a relatively safe distance. Previous simple throwing spears did a similar job, although the introduction of the spear thrower with its added leverage made a night and day difference. And in case you were looking for a modern day comparison of how this would have felt, just imagine you're throwing a ball for your dog. Now, imagine you're throwing a ball for your dog with one of those little flexible ball throwers. The added leverage of that ball thrower allows for a lot more force to be put into the throw. And it's these exact same principles that allowed the spear thrower to make the spear a much deadlier and much more efficient weapon. And similar to the bow and arrow, the exact origins of this weapon are unknown. Although some of the earliest archaeological evidence we've found on this weapon so far dates this weapon at least as far back as 30,000 years ago. However, it's theorized that the actual use of this weapon likely dates much further before that. We just simply don't have evidence to support it. The Bronze Age. No, not the guy that plays basketball. That's LeBron James. I'm talking about the time period that comes after the Stone Age, the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age is where we really begin to see the true start of technological development in humanity. And while, of course, the developments in the Stone Age were completely necessary and foundational for everything else we're going to discuss, taking hundreds of thousands of years to put a stick on a rock isn't exactly what I would call groundbreaking, at least in a modern context. Although, by the time that humanity ticked over into the Bronze Age, we quickly begin to see rapid and exponential growth in terms of societal development and, of course, the development of our weaponry. The first and most obvious development that applies to basically every weapon in the Bronze Age is, of course, the new material at play. That material being a product of early metallurgy, which of course is bronze. And with bronze came a plethora of new opportunities to create weapons. Now, I think that while it is somewhat obvious, it is worth mentioning that during the Bronze Age, stone tools did still exist and were used pretty frequently. However, even in those cases, the impact that bronze made on creating deadly weapons was undeniable. Most notably because of its pliability. In the Stone Age, if you wanted to create a weapon, you basically had to hit two rocks together until you got a rock that was sharp enough and small enough to your liking. However, with bronze forging, either by smelting or simply hot and cold forging, you could essentially customize the metal to your liking depending on your know-how and preferences, making the entire metal of copper that much deadlier than rocks. But with all that being said, let's highlight a few weapons that shined specifically in the Bronze Age and really made an impact in this era. One of the deadliest and most notable weapons to come out of the Bronze Age was a sword. But not just any sword, a sword known as the Now 2 sword. The Now 2 sword was a cut and thrust sword, meaning it could stab or slash your enemies to death. The sword primarily was used as a warfare sword, and it absolutely changed close quarters combat. This weapon first appeared in northern Italy, and following its invention or creation, this weapon was an industry standard tool not just in the Bronze Age, but also far into the Iron Age as well, due to how simple it was to create and how effective it was and durable it was at completing its task. Not all Now 2 swords were built the same. Some were as long as 85 centimeters, making them proper swords. However, some were as short as 60 centimeters or even less, making them almost closer to daggers. Now, during the Bronze Age, bronze daggers, bronze spears, and bronze axes all existed. However, it was really the bronze Now 2 sword that created a seemingly entirely new method of combat. And if you are somebody who had never encountered a Now 2 sword before, and your enemy just happened to be experienced in wielding it, you almost had no idea how to defend against it, making it that much deadlier. Prior to this sword, double-edged weapons that could hack, slash, stab easily and lethally were almost unheard of. And when you consider the fact that this weapon was used in a time where armor was either unused or extremely primitive, you can see why it didn't take much from this sword to disarm and dislife your enemy. Now, even though the Now 2 sword is undoubtedly iconic and potentially one of the deadliest weapons in all of the Bronze Age, in my opinion, it's cool, but not the coolest. Introducing the Khopesh, an Egyptian sickle-shaped sword that was actually originally developed from battle axes. The Khopesh is most recognizable by its curved blade, and it's actually this blade that made it extremely effective in combat during the Bronze Age. This curve was most notably utilized by soldiers who would hook and pull down the shields of enemies, or, in worse cases, hook the necks and shoulders of enemies and deal significant damage. Generally speaking, the Khopesh was shorter than the Now 2 sword, being roughly 50 to 60 centimeters in length. Although, don't let the size fool you, because this blade was extremely deadly and was undoubtedly cause of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of deaths during the Bronze Age. I don't know about you, but if I saw two people, one holding a Now 2 sword and the other holding a Khopesh, I would likely fear the Khopesh more just because the sword looks more intimidating. But we're not done there. Two final notable weapons from the Bronze Age are firstly, bronze arrow tips, something that isn't necessarily a new weapon or even a weapon entirely, but more of an advancement to an existing weapon. But it's worth mentioning because the introduction of bronze arrow tips made making arrows a lot more efficient and also made arrows a lot deadlier. The density of the metal allowed for further penetrating potential, and the malleability of this metal allowed for arrow tips to be created with barbs in them, meaning that if an enemy survived and tried to pull your arrow out of their wound, more damage would be done as a result of that barb. And another, I guess, not exact weapon, but weapon accessory is the chariot. During the Bronze Age, chariots were not only a huge development in warfare, but were also the biggest flex. Civilizations like the Hittites and the Egyptians used chariots as status symbols for the elites, but in warfare, they were also used as more of a hit-and-run attack, where chariots could seemingly run up on enemy infantry, slice them as they pass by, and continue on their route, creating history's first drive-bys. And while, as I said, chariots themselves weren't particularly deadly, the combination of a Now 2 sword with a chariot or a bronze-tipped spear on a chariot definitely allowed for some crazy unfair advantages on the battlefield. And while it might not have the highest kill count, I would definitely argue that a soldier with a chariot is definitely deadlier than a soldier without one. The Iron Age. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, as I've said numerous times before, was the complete opposite of a smooth transition in human history. This time was extremely tumultuous, and in some parts of the world, civilizations were either set back hundreds of years or wiped out entirely by this transition. And while as you get deeper into the Iron Age, you see obvious improvements into human civilization, specifically in urban planning, societal structure, agriculture, legal systems, and basically everything associated with society, it did definitely take time to get there. Bronze was replaced with iron because it was harder and easier to use. Trade routes got bigger, armies got bigger, battles got bigger, architecture got more complex, weapons got improved, and armor more or less got popularized. Now, despite everything I just said, the Iron Age is not a bad time period in any means. The development and evolution of society as a whole during the Iron Age is some of the most quick and impressive we've seen in all of human history so far, especially considering the entire setback that took place in between the Bronze and Iron Ages. And while there is a lot of iterations compared to evolutions in the Iron Age, we all know that humans love their weapons. In the Iron Age, while it did definitely iterate on some of the most popular weapons of the Bronze Age, it also brought a plethora of new opportunities, and I'm going to quickly mention one of each. The most notable iteration we see in the Iron Age is likely the Gladius sword. To put it in extremely simple terms, the Gladius sword was relatively similar to the Now 2 sword we saw in the Bronze Age, which also just goes to show how iconic the Now 2 sword was, once again. The Gladius sword, pound for pound, was likely the deadliest weapon in all of the Iron Age due to how popular, how widespread, and how effective it was. If you were to put a Gladius sword head-to-head with a Now 2 sword, a Gladius sword would easily destroy it. Mainly because iron is a much harder metal. And unless the Gladius was poorly treated and the Now 2 was extremely well treated, there was no chance a Now 2 sword would survive a sword fight against a Gladius. But as I said, the Gladius is more of an iteration and less of an invention, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. One of the most interesting and potentially deadliest inventions of the Iron Age is undoubtedly the catapult. Appearing pretty late into the Iron Age, the catapult is definitely a sign of the times. As I said, during the Iron Age, societies and settlements got bigger, armies got bigger, and for that reason, we needed bigger weapons. And the catapult fit that shoe perfectly. Some of the earliest Iron Age catapults appeared in the 4th century BC. And were used by the ancient Greeks. Interestingly, the first ever catapults weren't like the catapult you would imagine in your head. They didn't have the classic throwing arm like you may imagine, and they were actually basically massive crossbows. Although it didn't take long for the ancient Greeks to create the torsion catapult, which is the catapult you likely think of when you hear the term. The impact that the catapult made in warfare was undeniable, and the biggest area of impact was in sieges. Prior to the catapult, if there was a large fortified city, you had to fight like hell to even have a chance of getting inside. However, with a catapult, you could sling huge stones, bolts, flaming bundles of wood, or even dead bodies over the walls of settlements or even through the walls of settlements to create massive damage and ultimately create or expose vulnerabilities in forts. And one of the best parts about catapults is that you could do all of this damage to a settlement without even being near it. catapults had massive ranges, meaning you could be hundreds of feet away and still do significant damage at basically no risk. If that's not game-changing, I don't know what is. The medieval era. The medieval era is another time period where we see a lot of iteration, with notable improvements to, at this point, old technology. However, like the Iron Age, the medieval era also has a few new tricks up its sleeve. Let's first start with the iterations. One of the biggest iterations that was a lethal force in the medieval era was undoubtedly the longbow, specifically the English and Welsh longbow. The Welsh longbow was notable for numerous reasons, but most commonly because of its high rate of fire. Experienced archers using the longbow could fire anywhere from 6 to 12 arrows per minute. And considering this bow's heavy draw, which has its pros and cons, the piercing power of this longbow was still effective at ranges up to 300 meters away. And in the medieval era, piercing power is an extremely notable attribute because armor was refined and popular. Meaning that if you wanted to use a bow, it had to be able to pierce a knight's chestplate, chainmail, and wool undergarments. And the longbow was able to do that at range. During numerous battles within the 100 Years' War, it was proven time and time again that English longbowmen were able to repeatedly defeat larger French armies simply because the English armies had large amounts of longbowmen and the French armies were primarily knights. But since we already discussed the bow and arrow in detail in the Stone Age, let's now discuss something new, something also not too distantly related, the crossbow. The crossbow was not only a deadly invention in the medieval era, but it was also a controversial one. Similar to the longbow, the crossbow had high penetrating power against armor, something crucial at the time, and it was also much easier to use. And while the crossbow didn't have the same range as the longbow, it had the benefit of being effective at short ranges, something the longbow was missing. Like, just imagine you're defending your castle, you have your sword, and you can hear the enemy army making its way up your tower. You're hiding in the corner of the room when you hear a knock on the door, and this knock on the door is followed by a knight kicking down your door. But this knight isn't wielding a sword like you are. This knight is wielding a crossbow and he's pointing it at your head. No matter what you do in that situation, a knight with a crossbow is far deadlier than anybody with a sword, at least in most cases. The crossbow became so known for its effectiveness and its potential cruelty that it actually earned itself the stigma of being unchivalrous during the medieval era. And it's the same stigma that later led to the Pope attempting to restrict the use of crossbows among Christians, which is crazy to think about. But that's just how deadly and how feared the crossbow was in the medieval era. It was literally so good that even God wanted you to stop using it. The early modern era. If the early modern era followed the same naming scheme as some of the other time periods on this list, then it would actually be called the gunpowder era. And that's because in the early modern era, we see possibly one of the most significant developments in weaponry in all of human history so far. That, of course, being black powder. Now, in the name of historic accuracy, there was some usage of black powder earlier in China, although those very primitive guns I don't think hold a candle to some of the guns we're about to discuss. And it's really in the early modern era where we see an establishment of black powder as a force to be reckoned with, and guns to be a staple in armories across the globe. In the context of the early modern era, one of the significant guns was of course the musket. However, not all muskets were made the same. Early muskets, known as matchlock muskets, were effective but heavily vulnerable to wet conditions. This is because, unsurprisingly, the matchlock system on early muskets required a slow-burning match to ignite the black powder, and wet conditions could easily extinguish this match, completely nullifying your gun altogether. However, later in the early modern era, circa late 1600, early 1700, we see the introduction of the flintlock. And the biggest improvement the flintlock made on the matchlock was the fact that ignition of black powder was caused by a spring-loaded piece of flint that would strike steel, instantly causing a spark in even moist conditions, creating a more consistent and more reliable firearm. If popes were trying to ban crossbows, I could only imagine what they would have thought if they had muskets in the medieval era. And while they technically did at the very, very end, that was basically the early modern era, and those weren't really muskets. Muskets, while not perfect, definitely served as potentially the deadliest weapon if you were to match up a musket against any other weapon we've talked about, in at least a one-on-one battle. And while I could go on about the intricacies of muskets specifically, as well as the damage they cause, at the end of the day, it's realistically just a gun, albeit an early gun that absolutely devastated battlefields for hundreds of years. although it's not the only interesting weapon or deadly weapon from the early modern era. Having a metal tube that shoots small projectiles out of your hand is cool, but you know what's cooler? Having a huge metal tube that shoots huge metal balls that you could position on forts or even on battleships. Of course, I'm talking about cannons. Cannons essentially served the same purpose that catapults did all the way back in the Iron Age. Cannons were easily able to disrupt formations, absolutely devastate forts, and they could do both of these things much more effectively than any catapult ever could. And on top of this, they were mobile. Cannons on land were devastating enough, but cannons in battleships absolutely devastated naval warfare. And it was with the introduction of naval cannons and its disruption in naval warfare that enabled European expansion globally during this time period. When you are the first to standardize gunpowder weapons, you effectively own the seas and land. And while the air wasn't in the question yet, it would be in the near future. And gunpowder would have a huge impact on that as well. Regardless, the massive global expansion we saw of Europe during this time period was largely enabled, as I just alluded to, by the usage and domination of and with black powder and gunpowder based weapons. The modern era. Starting this section, I did want to lead with one of the biggest iterations on technology ever. And what I mean by that is in the early modern era, we saw the invention and the widespread usage of black powder and muskets. However, in the modern era, specifically in 1884, we saw guns completely change essentially overnight. And this change would undoubtedly change the future forever. In 1884, a man named Hiram Stevens Maxim invented the Maxim gun. And this was the world's first fully automatic machine gun. Previously, every time you fired a gun, you had to manually load it yourself, and every shot had to count. Because if you missed, you had to take the time to reload. And that time could be life or death. However, the Maxim gun completely changed how guns work by using the energy from each shot to automatically eject used cartridges, load a new round, and fire again. Meaning that the gun would not only shoot a bullet, but it would use some of that energy to get the next bullet ready, creating a continuous cycle, ultimately allowing for rapid-fire automatic shooting. Combining that automatic fire mechanism with a belt-fed ammunition system ultimately led to the death of exponentially more soldiers on the battlefield, simply because for the first time ever, you could shoot indiscriminately into the battlefield, taking out tens, if not hundreds of enemies without so much as a thought put into missed shots. The introduction of the Maxim gun is almost as significant as the introduction of the gun itself. And while it is a technological and engineering marvel, it is also an extremely dark invention when you consider the amount of lives it's taken, in a way that seemingly requires almost no effort. The Maxim gun, while devastating, definitely isn't the deadliest weapon in the modern day, although it was for its time. And later iterations of it, the modern day machine gun, definitely are. Which leads me to a pretty interesting question that kind of pertains to this entire video. If you were to determine the deadliest weapon of a time period, would you consider it to be the weapon that caused the most deaths in that time period? Or would it be a weapon that has the most potential to cause death in that time period? Because realistically, in the modern era, the deadliest weapon could very well be the AK-47, simply because it's been estimated that anywhere from 40 to 150 million AK-47s have been made over the course of its existence. And with how commonly used this gun is, it's very possible that this gun could have potentially caused the most deaths out of any gun in human history. Although, if you were to ask somebody what's deadlier, an AK-47 or an ICBM, you would almost feel foolish to say the AK-47. Regardless of what you consider to be the deadliest, both of those entries made it on this list for me. The AK-47 is no stranger to anybody who's played Call of Duty. And assuming most of the people watching this video fit that bill, I won't go into much detail. The Kalashnikov AK-47 is a Soviet-produced assault rifle that, as I mentioned earlier, is likely the most produced weapon of all time. And while death toll estimates are nearly impossible to calculate, due to the sheer production volume alone, it's safe to assume this gun has likely caused more death than we could ever imagine. Although, if we're speaking about imagining, then the most death we could likely imagine would probably come from an atom bomb. Atom bombs and nuclear weapons as a whole are potentially one of the scariest genres of weapon you could possibly discuss. Mainly because while every weapon we've discussed has the potential to kill human life, atomic bombs easily have the potential to end all human life entirely. And while the number of deaths caused by atomic bombs is relatively low compared to basically any of the weapons we've discussed on this list, the sheer potential of atomic bombs and nuclear weapons undoubtedly deserves them possibly the highest ranking spot on this entire list. And while you could argue that certain chemical weapons or biological warfare agents could cause as much death, nothing would be as destructive to humanity and the world as an all-out nuclear war. But since that's a scary and pretty existential thought, let me lighten the mood by quickly drawing a cute picture. Okay, here. Check it out. I just drew a kitten on this notepad. You can keep it. The craziest prison escapes from around the world. The year is 2030, and you and the love of your life are looking out of the window of a luxury helicopter at the beautiful landscape of southern France. Doesn't that just sound like the best vacation ever and a dream come true? Now imagine this. Swap luxury helicopter for old hijacked helicopter, swap the love of your life for one of your co-conspirators, and swap helicopter tour with prison escape. And while you're still in the south of France, you're in a much different situation. And this situation is one of the craziest French prison escapes ever. Our story begins on July 7th, 1963, when our protagonist Pascal Payet was born. And while Pascal had a relatively normal childhood in the south of France, it wasn't long before he started his criminal career and lived a life that was anything but normal. In 1988, at the ripe age of 25, Pascal was convicted of his first crime, aggravated assault. And only 5 years later, in 1993, he was once again convicted of conspiracy. But it wasn't until 4 years after that, on November 20th, 1997, when Pascal's story truly began. Pascal and a group of other French criminals planned and executed an attack on an armored vehicle for the Bank of France. The robbery of this armored vehicle was anything but smooth, and during the robbery, one of the guards of this vehicle was killed, turning a robbery case into a murder case and beyond. Pascal and his associates were able to leave the scene of the crime successfully that day, but they weren't free for long, because in 1999, Pascal, along with his associate Eric Alborio, were found and arrested in Paris. I want to emphasize, all of this is horrible, and he definitely deserves to be in jail, but it's crazy that already this guy is literally living like it's GTA France. But if you think the actions that got Pascal into jail were GTA-esque, just wait until I tell you how he got out of jail. It is January 1999, and Pascal has just arrived in Loenia. He sees a structure begin to appear outside of the prison bus window. This is a maximum security French prison, and it has existed for over 2 centuries, seeing over the years the craziest list of almost any criminal you could imagine. The history of this place alone is insane, and with centuries to refine their techniques, they were no amateurs when it came to holding and punishing criminals. This prison was built and rebuilt numerous times throughout the last 2 centuries, and its most recent iteration was regarded as one of the most technologically advanced prisons in all of France, and it was considered escape-proof. And if you watched our first video about prison escapes, then you know that escape-proof prisons are not a title, they're a challenge. And to Pascal, that challenge seemed enticing. As Pascal is walked into his cell and sat on his bed, the guards uncuff his ankles and wrists, slam the door behind them, and Pascal is now officially in his new, all-expenses-paid home in the south of France. And the timer has officially begun. To the French government, the timer is counting down the amount of days that Pascal has left to serve. However, in Pascal's brain, a different timer has begun. The timer to plan an escape. And while Pascal had 30 years to sit and think about his plan, it only took him 2 years to theorize and execute his grand escape. Or escapes, I should say. It is October 12th, 2001, and it has been 2 years since Pascal has been behind bars. And over this time, he has been coordinating strategically with one man on the outside, a man named Frederic Impoko. And together, they put together a plan to quickly and easily take Pascal out of this prison. And today was the day they executed the plan. The plan began with Impoko hijacking a helicopter and flying it over top of the prison. The helicopter then quickly landed in a designated part of the courtyard where Pascal would enter the helicopter and the two would fly away into freedom. Although the plan didn't go that smoothly, because although they both got away successfully out of the jail, only 6 days later, Impoko was detained and taken in for questioning. But while Impoko was now behind bars, Pascal was a free man once again. But unfortunately, he still needed to make a living now that he was on the outside. And he dove right back into the only career he knew, stealing. And for 2 years, while on the run, Pascal would rob small-time jewelry stores and live off the profits from his heists. But after those 2 years, he must have began to get lonely, or maybe he felt bad for leaving his associates behind. Because on April 14th, 2003, Pascal decided that being free alone wasn't good enough, and he wanted to free some of his friends as well. And that is exactly what he did. Pascal once again organized a helicopter escape from the exact same prison that he escaped from 2 years earlier. This time, he was already free, and he was now freeing imprisoning 3 other men, the same men that were involved in the bank truck heist in 1997. And once again, a helicopter was hijacked, flown over top of the prison, quickly landing to pick up the criminals, and then flying off into the sunset. But once again, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, because this time it wasn't just one of the men that were caught. 3 weeks after this second helicopter prison escape, all of the men were caught. There's absolutely no question that Pascal is a bad man, but he's definitely a good friend to his fellow criminals, proving that maybe there is honor among thieves after all. Interestingly, while imprisoned, once again, Pascal decided to take another approach, and instead of planning another escape, he decided to write a blog post. A blog post specifically about the mistreatment he was experiencing in the French prison system. He complained that the conditions he were experiencing was poor, and he was also complaining of being transferred so many times, specifically being transferred 9 times in 30 months. And in combination with this letter, he also went on a hunger strike in one of these prisons because he didn't want to be moved again. These attempts were unsuccessful, but they, happened. At this point, Pascal is behind bars for good, right? He was able to coordinate 2 separate helicopter escapes, and at this point, he is now serving so much time behind bars. Like, seriously, after all of the dust had settled, Pascal was facing 30 years for the murder that happened on the truck in 1997, 6 years for the jailbreak that happened in 2001, 7 years for busting his friends out in 2003, and now he's resorted to writing blog posts and not eating. So now he's not only mentally given up, but also physically frail. There's no way that he's, going to have any other escapes, right? And the answer is, of course not. By the time that July 2007 rolled around, Pascal was one of the most closely monitored prisoners in all of France, and for good reason. And what that looked like was consistent surveillance by guards and also being placed permanently in solitary confinement. In combination with both of those measures, Pascal was also moved every 6 months to new prisons so that he couldn't formulate a plan for too long, which also ironically increased his transfer frequency, something he was trying to get reduced with his hunger strike and letter. Regardless, even with all of these measures in place, Pascal still had a bit more fight in him. And on July 14th, 2007, on Bastille Day, a national holiday in France, Pascal made his final escape. If you're unfamiliar with Bastille Day, imagine the 4th of July, but in France. Fireworks, food, friends, family, just a lot of festive things. And while many see this as an opportunity to relax, Pascal saw this as an opportunity to get to work. And work he did. Because while all of the festivities were happening outside and law enforcement were already busy enough with all of the festivities happening, 4 men in ski masks were quickly approaching a French airport to once again hijack a helicopter. These men were successful. They kidnapped a pilot, hijacked the helicopter, and forced this pilot to fly over the prison that Pascal was currently in. The helicopter once again landed in the prison. The men went into the prison and freed Pascal from his solitary confinement, and in only 5 minutes after arriving, the helicopter was flying out of the jail. The criminals forced the pilot to fly 40 kilometers northeast to a location on the Mediterranean coast, where they had the pilot land the helicopter, and the pilot and the helicopter were free. And unfortunately, so was Pascal Payet. 2 days after this escape took place, a Europe-wide arrest warrant was placed against Pascal Payet, and even still, it took over 2 months for Pascal to be caught. However, on September 21st, 2007, in a suburb of Barcelona, Spain, Pascal was caught and once again put into French custody, where he remains to this very day. This story is almost picture perfect and kinda has everything you want. A beautiful European landscape, helicopters, crime, suspense, helicopters, friendship. It's really got it all, and I knew for that reason I had to make it the first entry on this list. Because seriously, how do you have 3 consecutive prison escapes all involving hijacked helicopters? Like, if nothing else, you've got to admit that this guy is consistent. Pascal found his method and just worked it till he couldn't anymore. What I find crazy is now, after the 3rd successful helicopter escape, the police have decided that they're going to make the location of Pascal private for security reasons, obviously to avoid a 4th helicopter escape, which I think is logical and possibly a bit, late, but I guess still worth doing. But yeah, it's just crazy to think that there's a good chance that Pascal could have been a free man after his first successful helicopter escape. At the time, he was behind bars and facing 30 years for a murder that took place in 1997, but decided that even though he was free, he wanted to go back and help his 3 friends escape as well, which is something I really wish I knew the motivation behind, but I guess that is kind of up to speculation. He could have freed his friends because, he wanted his friends to have the same freedom as him, or maybe because he was, as a free man still living a life of crime, he wanted his crime friends back so he could, have more people to commit crime with. It's really up in the air on his motivation, but regardless, he did it. And now, as of today, his laundry list of charges goes as follows: 30 years for the murder, 6 years for jailbreak 1, 7 years for jailbreak 2, 5 years for jailbreak 3, and on top of all of these, an additional 15 years for all of the robberies that took place while he was a free man. At that point, he would have been better off just serving his initial 30 years. But I guess the moral of the story here is crime never pays. Now, what do you get when you mix 2 charming, intelligent, cold-blooded killers, a lonely and vulnerable prison employee, and paper-thin prison walls? Well, you'd be getting our next story. Richard Ricky Matt was born on June 25th, 1966, and grew up in foster care in Buffalo, New York. His childhood was anything but desirable. Throughout the course of his adult life, he had served multiple prison sentences that were shorter term. But once he was free again after serving his time, he decided that his best course of action was to get a job and then 2 weeks after working there, rob, kidnap, and murder his boss. And after this murder, he fled to Mexico, where he, a year later, robbed and killed another man. For this second murder, he received a 23-year sentence. But in 2007, Richard was extradited back to the United States, where he received a 25 to life sentence for his first murder, the murder of William Wickerson, the man who tried to give this convict a career and an opportunity, only to be robbed, kidnapped, and murdered and dismembered by the man he was only trying to help. Regardless, Richard was convicted of second-degree murder and was sent to the Clinton Correctional Facility in New York State. David Paul Sweat was born on June 14th, 1980, in Binghamton, New York State. He was raised by a single mother and grew up with 2 sisters, and from a child, he was a troubled individual. Even as young as 9, David was demonstrating extremely violent tendencies, and for that reason, his mom sent him to Florida to live with his uncle, which resulted in David stealing and wrecking his aunt's car, and his aunt and uncle then sending him into foster care. During his late teens, Sweat was essentially homeless, living off of any money he could make selling weed. It was during this time that he began planning elaborate burglaries. And throughout his late teens in the 1990s, Sweat was arrested and sent to prison multiple times, where he served his sentences. But on the 4th of July in 2002, Sweat, his cousin, and a third accomplice decided that they would cash in on the profits of 4th of July and robbed a fireworks store in Pennsylvania. Not to steal fireworks, however, but to steal guns. These 3 men were successfully able to steal the firearms. And that night, after the robbery, drove from Pennsylvania back to New York State, where they planned on splitting up the loot. The 3 men pulled into a dimly lit parking lot where the others' cars were parked, and they began to divide up the loot. But while transferring guns from one of the cars to the other, a police officer spotted what was going on and decided to investigate. As the police officer began to approach the man, Sweat opened fire on the police officer, but didn't kill him. That was until Sweat decided to run over this police officer with his vehicle and then drive away. After Sweat was gone, Sweat's cousin decided to then shoot the police officer in the head again. The men all left the parking lot, but fortunately, only a few days later, all 3 men were caught. Sweat pled guilty to avoid the death sentence and was convicted of first-degree murder, and he was too sent to the Clinton Correctional Facility. I'm sure you're already seeing a bit of similarities and differences between these 2 horrible people. Richard and David both spent time in foster care, both had violent tendencies, and both had numerous run-ins in the law and spent time in prison before the time they ever even met, which leads us to when they did meet, which obviously took place within the Clinton Correctional Facility in New York State. And unfortunately, these 2 didn't only serve time together, but formed a rather twisted friendship, and shortly after bonding, began planning their escape from prison. At the beginning of this story, I did mention that these men were intelligent and charming, and unfortunately, that is the case for most psychopaths, something that obviously both of these men were. They had no empathy, no remorse, and no issue killing innocent people for their own gain. But another key component of psychopaths are their tendency to manipulate people, and that tendency to manipulate was a huge factor in the eventual escape of Richard and David. And that escape in question is kind of a blend of the very real Alcatraz escape that I actually talked about in the first prison escape video and the fictional Shawshank Redemption prison escape. Early on in their plans to escape, they both knew that if they wanted to escape, they were going to need some serious help. And because of this, the first step in their plan involved manipulating somebody on the inside to begin helping them. And that person on the inside was Joyce Mitchell. Mitchell was an older woman working as a supervisor in the Taylor department of the prison. And for reasons unknown to us, Richard and David decided that she was the perfect person to convert to their side. And how they went about doing this was extremely upsetting, because they used not aggression or fear, but love. Both of these men individually began to develop intimate relationships with Joyce Mitchell within the prison, and over time were able to get her to begin helping them by providing supplies, specifically by getting tools out of the prison workshop, hiding them in burger meat, and delivering them to these 2 criminals. Now, I don't want to make Joyce Mitchell kind of sound like the innocent victim in the story, because it did come out that there was a plan that David and Richard would kill Joyce's husband. But yeah, don't think of her as some victim. She was complicit in this. But just imagine the sheer riz of these 2 men. Like, Mitchell has a husband, a job, and somehow she was able to be manipulated and convinced by 2 criminals that the best course of action of her was to aid these criminals in their escape, and once these criminals escape, they can kill her husband and then all go to Mexico together. Like, that is crazy level manipulation. Once Richard and David had Mitchell on their side, their plan was in full effect. And from that point, it only took 6 months for that plan to be executed. Over these 6 months, Mitchell would slowly bring different tools and components into the jail cells of each of these men, and possibly do other things as well. Regardless, once these men had the tools, they were able to begin chipping away at their very own cell walls. Similar to the Alcatraz escapes, both of these men developed holes in their cells under the sink where they could slip into the endless labyrinth of tunnels existing within the prison. The men were quickly able to access the tunnel system behind the walls. However, it took most of that 6 months to develop a plan on exactly where to go in the tunnel system and also to cut holes into huge steam pipes that they would eventually climb through for their escape. There's actually an investigation video showing 2 investigators going from the prison cell to the manhole cover, showing exactly how long and tight and uncomfortable this entire journey is. And it took the investigators only 20 minutes to get through all of it. This includes going down 6 stories via catwalks and pipes, and then traveling across the pipeline, going through small holes in the wall between blocks until they eventually get to a huge steam pipe that they likely took months to cut a hole into. And how they would do this is literally every night, making this entire journey to make slight holes in the pipe until they could finally cut the whole chunk of metal out of the pipe. And then eventually, once they could go into this pipe, they were able to climb through it, enter the final room that led them to essentially a sewer under the road, roughly 150 meters outside of the prison, where they could climb a ladder, raise the manhole cover, and be free. But the story doesn't end there, because even though Mitchell, up until this point, only brought the men tools, she also was supposed to be the getaway driver. But on the night of the escape, Mitchell had a panic attack, thought she was having a heart attack, and went to the hospital. So a different prison employee actually ended up being their getaway driver. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. On June 5th, 2015, at 10:30 p.m., both Matt and David were accounted for in the nightly head count at the prison. However, the next morning on June 5th at 5:50 a.m., during morning count, they were unaccounted for, and the search began. It only took a few hours for the prison to notice the external breach. They had only 150 meters outside of the prison wall. It was the obviously open manhole cover that had led directly to the basement of the prison. Due to this discovery, it didn't take long for investigators to find out exactly how Richard and David escaped. Interestingly, when the investigators were looking through the tunnel system that they used to escape, they found an interesting note. It was simply a piece of paper that said, "Have a nice day," and drawn below that was a racist Asian smiley face with a triangular rice hat, which is just odd. But now the men were free, but their plans were still not completed. The original plan was to murder Mitchell's husband and then flee to Mexico. But with Mitchell in the hospital and them having a completely different getaway driver, they decided their best bet was to go to Canada. But they couldn't just go straight there, and they had to take their time. And during that time, roughly 3 weeks, there was an extensive manhunt that was established by both the American and Canadian governments to make sure that these 2 men did not escape. 20 days after the initial escape, one of the 2 men was spotted for the first time. Richard Matt was spotted in Franklin County, New York. He was spotted because he was shooting at traffic with a 20-gauge shotgun taken from a hunting camp. Obviously, when you shoot at pedestrians, the police are going to get involved. And shortly after, Matt was shooting at civilians. The police shot and killed Richard. But that's only Richard. At the time of Richard's death, David's location was still unknown, and the investigation was still well underway. And I can only assume for law enforcement that finding David was a lot more personal, as David was somebody who did kill a police officer. However, only 2 days after Richard was shot by police officers, David was spotted just jogging on the side of the road. The police officer that spotted him went to question him, where David began to run through a field and into a wooded area. The police officer quickly drew his pistol and shot David. However, David did not die. Interestingly, both of these 2 men were found only 2 kilometers from the Canadian-US border, meaning that if they weren't found when they did, they would have likely made it into Canada and possibly escaped conviction or death altogether. Or at the very least, they would have extended their freedom by quite a bit. After everything was said and done, Richard Matt was killed. Sweat pled guilty to an additional 2 counts of felony, first-degree escape, and an additional count of promoting prison contraband, which gave him an additional 7 years, which was served consecutively with his previous life sentence. Joyce Mitchell pled guilty and received 7 years in prison and a $6,300 fine, as well as $80,000 in restitution. And as of February 2020, she was actually released and is now on parole. And Gene Palmer, the backup driver and the other prison official who aided in the escape of these 2 killers, was sentenced to 6 months in jail and fined $5,300. So yeah, if you haven't learned anything in this video so far, I think one important takeaway is that if you ever do plan on escaping prison, 2 good ways of going about it are having a helicopter or just extreme riz. And at this point, I can't even imagine the possibilities of a man with extreme riz and a helicopter. Jokes aside, let's just move on to the next and final entry on this list. And I say this list because if you guys like this concept, feel free to leave a like or a comment below letting me know you like prison escape videos. I'd be more than happy to make more of them in the future. Your support always means a lot. Let's move on. Alfred George Hines was born in 1917, and at the young age of only 7 years old, his father died when he was caught for an armed robbery and was served corporal punishment that actually ended up killing him. He was sentenced to 10 lashes from the Cat 06, which is just a crazy whip, and this entire process killed him. And because of this, Hines decided to run away from home at the age of 7. Hines briefly stayed at an orphanage before he escaped and began living on his own and surviving off of petty theft, which later landed him in a juvenile detention center, which he, at that point, once again escaped from. Hines' upbringing was troubled to say the least, and when he turned 21, he was drafted into the Second World War, something he didn't actually do because he deserted the armed forces and went back to his full-time career of crime, which resulted in a jewelry heist that happened in 1953. This heist performed by Hines was in the multiple six-figure range, and 90,000 of that was never found, ever. But shortly after this jewel heist, Hines was caught and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. But like everybody else we've discussed on this list so far, Hines had no plans of staying in jail for his entire sentence. Only a few weeks into his stay in prison, Hines realized that at night, the guards were severely outnumbered, and there was really only 2 night guards per 1,000 inmates, which meant that Hines had a lot of time to work on his craft, and his craft in this case was metalworking. And what he was able to do was fashion a scrap piece of metal into a makeshift key to release himself from his cell without ever being detected. But picking the lock in his cell wasn't the only challenge he faced on this escape, because after he was out of his cell and out of the prison itself, he still had to climb a 20-foot wall, a feat so impressive that the media instantly gave him the name Houdini Hines because of his escape. Just keep in mind, for the guards, they were doing their nightly routine when they were walking by and they saw Hines, and then maybe an hour or 2 hours later when they would walk by again, Hines' cell was empty, there was no signs of any damage, and there was absolutely nothing changed besides the fact that Hines wasn't there. If they didn't know any better, Hines could have just disappeared into thin air. Although, that obviously wasn't the case. And after his escape, Hines spent 248 days as a free man working odd jobs until he was arrested again in 1956. And it was at this point when he was sent back to prison. But Hines knew that because he was going back to prison, he was going to be made an example of, because his initial escape made national headlines. And this obviously embarrassed the prison system and the government. So now that they had him back in their claws, they weren't going to let him go. And because of this, Hines had to think fast. And what Hines decided to do was, as he was being sent to prison for the second time, he decided to sue the prison system for misconduct. And even as a criminal, he had the right to a trial. And it was at this trial where he was able to execute his second escape. While in the courtroom, he asked the judge if he could use the washroom for just a moment. The judge agreed, and 2 guards brought Hines directly to the washroom, where they unshackled his hands and feet and allowed him to use the facility. But as soon as Hines was unshackled, he pushed both of the guards into the bathroom and locked it with a padlock that was left in the hallway by a co-conspirator. And the only reason he was able to even lock this door at all was because the day before the trial, a co-conspirator of Hines installed screw eyes on the stall door so that he could actually apply the padlock and lock these 2 in the washroom. After Hines' hands and feet were free and the guards were locked in the bathroom, he instantly made a run for it, and for the next 5 hours escaped directly to the airport where he was waiting for the next flight out of England. But before he could catch any flight, he was caught and brought back to prison for a 3rd time. Within a year of being brought back to prison for the 3rd time, he made his 3rd and final escape. The escape itself was nothing to write home about, although it did go to show the sheer perseverance and dedication that Hines had to not being in prison. But after being caught for a final time and brought back to jail, he decided that escaping wasn't the way to go. And from that point on, he decided to consistently get into legal disputes with the prison system to try to prove his innocence or to get his jail time appealed. He was basically spending all of his time in jail using the legal system against itself to try to get out of jail ASAP. And while he wasn't successful at it, and he did serve the rest of his time in prison, he was able to win a few £1,000s from random settlements that he was pursuing. Hines also falls into the category of orphan / foster care child turned prison escapee, which is interesting. That's definitely not something I intended to do in this video, but it is an interesting consistency I've noticed throughout most of these prison escapes. And I think the fact that Hines was able to escape prison 3 times definitely earned him the nickname Houdini Hines. But once again, we find ourselves in a situation where Hines would have been better off just serving the initial 12 years than escaping and then serving the rest of his time. Sure, he had more breaks in between, but living as an active fugitive is definitely not a life that I would want to live. I couldn't imagine having to look over your shoulder every day just to try to live a normal life. But I know I said that this was the last story in the video, but I actually have a quick bonus one, so let's get into it. Yoga is really relaxing and has a lot of health benefits. But one of the benefits that most people don't talk about when they speak of yoga is escaping prison. But for Korean thief Choi Gap-bok, being an expert in yoga for over 23 years was the deciding factor between being in jail and being a free man. Let me explain. On September 12th, 2012, Choi Gap-bok was arrested in association with a mysterious theft. It was assumed that he was the leader of a theft ring, and for that reason, the police wanted to hold him until they could gather more evidence on him in the entire situation. And on that day, Choi was placed in a cell. And while his stay was at that point undetermined, Choi was personally determined to make that stay as short as possible. And how he did so was extremely interesting, because during Choi's time in this jail cell, he realized that at the bottom of the jail cell door, there was a hole. And this hole was useful for him because every day this is how the guards would feed him. But he quickly began to ponder if this was a hole he could fit through. The hole was only 15 centimeters tall and 45 centimeters wide. Not large at all, but Choi wasn't really a large man either. Choi was only 5'4" and weighed roughly 120 pounds. Even still, this hole was put in these doors for food, not people. One night, after being fed dinner, Choi asked one of the guards if he could have some skin ointment. He felt a rash coming on and he wanted to subdue it early. And luckily, the guards obliged. They handed him a skin ointment and then went back to their post. And late into that night, Choi waited until the 3 guards that were monitoring his cell fell asleep, which is when Choi began to execute his master plan. Choi applied this skin ointment all across his body to essentially lube up and slide through the crack on the bottom of the door. After applying the ointment to his skin, specifically his upper body and head, he was able to escape his cell in only 34 seconds. And after escaping his cell, he was easily able to sneak out of the jail and be a free man. Hours after Choi had snuck out of the jail and was running as far away as he could from the jail itself, the officers woke up and they looked in his cell, and when they tried to wake up Choi, they realized that Choi was in his bed. There was a decoy in the place he should have been, but there was no evidence of an escape until they checked the CCTV footage and realized exactly how he escaped. Interestingly, Choi, who was in a cell for 5 days, had the wherewithal to put a decoy in his bed when the previous 2 criminals we just talked about were planning for 6 months and still couldn't drum up a decoy in any of that time. Just an interesting observation. But what else is interesting is that even though Choi was able to make nearly an impossible escape and use his flexibility and lubrication skills to escape a jail cell, he was not able to remain free for long, because 6 days after his escape, he was recaptured and put into a cell with a much smaller food slot. This one was a lot shorter, but I kind of wanted to add it as a bonus because I just thought it was funny. Some lube and yoga can get you out of a lot of tough situations. How to get rich in every time period. Not too long ago, I made a video about what it was like to be rich in every time period, and you guys really liked that video. In that video, I talked about the experiences and the lifestyle of wealthy people in every time period, and only briefly touched on how that wealth was typically acquired. But in this video, I wanted to provide some perspective on how wealth could be made and how you could get rich in every time period. Let's get started. The Stone Age. This segment is likely going to be the most wholesome on the entire list, and that's just because the Stone Age was a simpler time. Genuinely, not many things were required to be wealthy, and the concept of being rich or wealthy didn't even exist. In the Stone Age, simply surviving was hard enough. So if you miraculously survived childbirth and somehow survived the brutality of a Stone Age childhood, you were already essentially a billionaire. And everything even remotely close to wealth had to do directly with your survivability. That meant food, shelter, water were your livelihood, and in turn, your wealth. So now that we understand that the modern concept of wealth simply doesn't apply here, what does wealth look like in the Stone Age, and how could you acquire it? Let's start from the beginning. Like I mentioned earlier, to be wealthy, you first need to be alive. And that means the basis of our wealth will be our life. And as a baby, our life is in the hands of our parents. So the original rich babies or boss babies or Nepo babies were simply kids that were lucky enough to have parents that didn't die during childbirth or didn't accidentally kill them or allow them to be killed in their likely harsh environment. Already, this is making me realize how much we take for granted. Next up, assuming your parents care about you, survived childbirth, don't plan on killing you, and are healthy, fit, and able to provide for you properly, you will be able to experience childhood the Stone Age way, which is basically just Minecraft, but not a game, just a reality. Now, assuming you survived your entire childhood and adolescence, you are now an adult in the Stone Age on your own, looking to build wealth for yourself. And by that, I mean literally just survive. I'm really stressing this point because it is extremely important to consider that simply surviving up until this point is a major achievement and basically the equivalent of being handed a $100 million trust fund as soon as you turn 18. But now in this hypothetical scenario, when you are alive, healthy, and on your own, what do you do next? Unfortunately, there is no online business or jobs, and if you want something, you have to go get it. Literally. The first thing you would need to get is food, which is the first and likely primary pillar of wealth in the Stone Age, a steady supply of food. Being on land that was fertile, not only for yourself but for animals, directly impacted your likelihood of survival, and therefore your wealth. If you lived in the right biome, nature would provide for you, as long as you were a semi-skilled hunter and in tune with your environment. However, the wrong biome would leave you starved and dehydrated in only a matter of days. This directly ties into the next pillar of wealth, which I'll combine two separate parts into one: location and shelter. Of course, food is essential for life and, in this case, wealth. But like we discussed, to have this steady source of food, you must have a conducive environment, which in itself is a form of wealth. But I kind of already made that point, so without repeating myself, let's discuss the second part of this: shelter. Depending on what part of the Stone Age we're talking about, because it does go pretty far back, a lot of shelters were more or less natural, with the most common being a cave, hence the term caveman. If you wanted to be rich, and I mean ultra rich, you lived on land that provided you food and also had shelter that was ready for you to move right in. Consider this prime real estate. This is the prehistoric equivalent of moving into a condo that has a restaurant on the main floor. It's everything you need all in one place. Well, almost everything. We're still missing an essential component, which is the third pillar, that being water. You now have your prime real estate. You have your cave. You have your wild berries growing outside your cave apartment, and you have a steady flow of cute critters that you stomp on and eat on a daily basis. But the last thing to make you a true bajillionaire is to have a steady stream of fresh water, ideally trickling right through a stream right outside of your cave. Without water, shelter and food is almost useless because you won't be around long to enjoy it. So this supply of water is the perfect trifecta for your life and, in this case, your wealth. But it's a bit boring if we end there. What's wealth without a bit of legacy? And maybe someone to share it with. Just because living was hard enough in the Stone Age doesn't mean that there wasn't additional luxuries you could indulge in. And for this example, let's pick our bonuses. I have my cave, I have my food, I have my water. What am I missing? I'd say a cave woman to spend my days with and unga bunga with at night. And with your partner by your side, you're now able to continue your legacy, have Caveman Jr., and ideally allow them to inherit your success. And by that I mean your cave doesn't get raided, the stream doesn't dry up, and the animals don't migrate elsewhere. And spoiler alert, those are all going to happen. And all of your hard work is basically null and void, because everything that you had to go through to build your wealth and literally survive is going to have to be done entirely from scratch once again by your children. I think I've made it crystal clear that wealth in the Stone Age is simply being alive. So to answer the question, how do you get rich in the Stone Age? You just don't die. The Bronze Age. No, not the guy that plays for the Lakers, the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age is really a landmark in terms of human development, and as we'll see in this segment, there are many changes between humans and wealth in the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. For starters, the Bronze Age is a much more concentrated timeline. The Stone Age, for example, literally goes on for millions of years, whereas the Bronze Age is roughly 2,000 years in total. Don't allow this relatively short timeline to fool you. The amount of development that took place during this era was rapid and impactful. Some major differences right off the bat between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age is that people began to settle. In the Stone Age, a lot of people were nomadic, similar to animals, going where the resources were, as typically ideal locations didn't last very long. But with the introduction of agriculture and other advanced survival techniques, people were able to settle in locations that were deemed ideal. One major difference between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age that was spawned out of settlements were possessions. Because when you are nomadic, you're not able to carry much with you, and for that reason, you didn't own much. On the contrary, when you have a place to call your own, you're able to start collecting a thing or two. And from that, begin to store value and ultimately accumulate wealth. Besides this, we are seeing early coinage, and with this, early commerce as well, which will serve as the foundation for how we measure wealth for the rest of the video. With developed skills, new tools, larger settlements, and early coinage, it's not hard to believe that trade was essentially inevitable. What did they trade, you may ask? Well, everything, but most importantly, bronze. And although settlements and trade are developing, it doesn't necessarily mean that life was all of a sudden easy at this point. Life was still difficult, and every skill and piece of luck required to survive in the Stone Age is still required now. But for the sake of this video, we're gonna assume this is more or less of a given, so we can focus on the specifics of what made you rich in the Bronze Age. Like we mentioned in the last video, during the Bronze Age, wealth began to be associated with the control and production of bronze, which is a valuable metal that is made from copper and tin. Being rich meant you had access to metal ores and the knowledge required to craft tools, weapons, and ornaments, which were things that everybody needed. Maybe not the ornaments, but tools and weapons definitely. Like I mentioned, with settlements growing, trade became more prominent, both inside of settlements and also between settlements via established trade routes. And if you are someone who was able to take advantage of these trade routes, you could significantly enhance your wealth. Besides commerce, another way to gain money and power was through social status, which started to become more of an important thing during this time period. During this time, chiefs and leaders would amass their wealth through the people that they ruled, whether they had full control over the tribe's resources or they simply took contributions from each of their people. Now that we have a bit more context on on the Bronze Age and what exactly wealth looked like in the Bronze Age, how could you get rich? For the sake of simplicity, let's assume that you had a great upbringing. Your parents were alive and you survived, and now you're 18 years old looking to build your life and become wealthy in the Bronze Age. Like I mentioned, you ultimately have two primary options. One is to become a merchant, or two, become a leader. We'll touch on both of these. Starting with becoming a merchant, the control and manufacturing of copper was a booming industry. So if I were planning to get rich, I would definitely start there. The first thing I would do is start looking for copper. I would make my wood and maybe even stone pickaxe and get straight to the mines, looking for any copper deposits I could find. Now, this isn't obviously the only way you could gain wealth. I think a better way to gain wealth in the Bronze Age is to become an artisan, specifically making the best type of either tool, weapon, or ornament. For this example, let's say that we want to make the best sword possible. In this case, I would go to a blacksmith and immediately beg them for their knowledge. I don't care if I was unpaid. I don't care if I was like SpongeBob at the Krusty Krab and I had to pay to work there. I would be getting my hours in at the blacksmith so I could hone in my skills on making the best swords possible. Why would I do that? Well, if I could make the best swords and gain a reputation as the guy who makes the best swords, which would hopefully be my official title, I would hope to potentially make a name for myself and ideally catch the attention of the powers that be. Because you know who needs swords? The troops. And you know who wants their troops to win battles? Leaders. And you know who has all of the money? Also leaders. For the most part. I think you see where I'm going here. That's just one example, but if you were doing anything valuable related to copper, chances are you were able to make a few shillings for yourself. But let's just say for this example, you weren't very inclined to mine or craft. And in that example, I would recommend you go the route of leadership. How would I go about that? I would first identify the powers that be. You could try to assassinate him and hopefully fill the power vacuum, but I think that the likelihood of that working out are low. This would definitely be a slow grind, but if you're willing to put in the time and you're charismatic enough, I think it could work. I would get as close as possible as I could to the leader, maybe potentially offering to be some sort of servant. At this point, I would do my absolute best to gain their trust, gain their respect, and ideally become someone that they consider to be a friend. Through this relationship, I would prove that my ideas were worthy and that I potentially had the skills to be a leader, without ever, of course, showing up the leader himself. At this point, over time, I would wait for opportunities to arise where I could potentially fill voids where leadership was needed or ideas were required. And hopefully, through my connection to the actual leader, I could become a person of power myself and benefiting from that sweet, sweet Bronze Age nepotism. Now, in reality, were people in the Bronze Age really so entrepreneurial focused or status focused that they'd be willing to cozy up to the king? I think potentially. And people like this definitely existed, but they weren't the norm. Most people were just trying to exist, and serfdom was basically hard labor all day to feed yourself and your family and potentially make a few dollars on the side, or simply to do your duties for the village that you lived in to make sure that you had the protection that they'd offered you. So to answer the question of how do you get rich in the Bronze Age, I'd say your best bet is to get involved in the bronze industry in any way that you think you would excel the most. In my example, I wanted to master blacksmithing swords and use this to my advantage to essentially get government contracts, or at the very least, sell desirable artisan swords to rich merchants and political leaders, and ultimately get that bag. The Iron Age. What a time to be alive. During the Bronze Age, we experienced more development in 2,000 years than we did during the over 3 million years of human existence in the Stone Age. Due to this exponential growth, you would likely assume that this trend continued into the Iron Age, but that's not exactly the case. Like we mentioned in the previous video, the end of the Bronze Age was a rather rough time, and due to major situations that happened, which are honestly worthy of their own video, most of the world was left in a place where production, trade routes, literacy, and overall progress were either diminished or reduced, making the Bronze Age more or less of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back sort of situation. That being said, it's not all doom and gloom because we're humans and we're chads, and we ultimately figured it out. Obviously, just look at us now. But that leads us to the beginning of the Iron Age. We needed to rebuild, and we needed to do it now. The beginning of the Iron Age was very similar to the beginning of the Bronze Age, with the primary difference, of course, being the metal at play, which, you guessed it, was iron. Iron wasn't necessarily a stronger material, but it was more readily available and it was easier to produce, which helped facilitate a lot of progress. Which is why, if you're paying attention to the dates, you'll notice that the Iron Age was also much shorter than the Bronze Age, and the Bronze Age was much, much, much shorter than the Stone Age. The exponential growth is still continuing even after the bump in the road. Now, that's a nice underdog story and all, but how do we get rich? Like I mentioned in the last video, being rich in the Iron Age was not very different than being rich in the Bronze Age. And I hate to break it to you, getting rich in the Iron Age also wasn't very different than getting rich in the Bronze Age. But I'll still give you a new hypothetical in this new time period. Let's assume that once again, you're a healthy, able-bodied 18-year-old ready to start your life. The artisan sword company that your parents had founded has now gone Bronze Age bankrupt and they are dead. for the sake of the story, they just died too. They went broke and died. So now you're here, alone, looking to get that bag in the Iron Age. What do you do? Once again, you have two options. Get involved in emerging industries, in this case, the production of iron, or try to get as cozy as possible with the powers that be, which at this point in time isn't an easy task. So in this case, I'm becoming an iron mogul. With establishments growing and jobs becoming more or less of a thing, my plan is to find and own the best iron deposit my settlement and likely other settlements have ever seen. But here's the thing, if I'm just one guy looking around for iron deposits, I may not be that successful, and I may miss things. And even once I do find it, there's a lot of work to be done there. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'll need help. First thing I'll do is go to the nearest farm. I'm gonna try to round up as many farmers that I can find who are no longer interested in farming and looking for a better opportunity. At this point, everyone's been seeing the new and shiny iron tools and they know that they're expensive. And likely they're interested and want their own. And my proposal to them would be, join my team, help me find an iron deposit, let's mine it together, and with you, I will share the rewards. Realistically, the proposal is no money up front, but a lot of money down the line if you're willing to work with me. And once I have a good group of guys, we're ready to go. Day one, we're looking, searching, scoundering, floundering, sleuthing, anything we can do to find iron deposits. Once this has been achieved, we begin the hard work, mining. We gather as much as we can and determine how good this vein of iron really is. And if we see potential, we set up camp. Once we begin mining, we begin either collaborating with an existing manufacturing facility or we build our own to be able to turn the raw materials into a usable iron to make tools, weapons, and once again, ornaments. Once we get a more refined process, we then begin to stockpile and finally sell our refined material. We could sell the raw material, but we also know that if we sell a more refined material, we can get more money. And from that point, we begin our journey. All of the men that were mining are now selling. Door to door, potentially. We are going to every blacksmith and offering them the best iron in the best condition with minimal work on their end. Just heat it and forge it. What more could you want? Ideally, once again, the leaders at B take notice and want to buy my iron, but I'm happy if even just the blacksmiths prefer mine. At this point, we begin to collect money and it's a beautiful system. In the Bronze Age, I wanted to make the swords, and in the Iron Age, I was the person selling the materials to those artisans. Is this a realistic plan? I highly doubt it. This oversimplified, trust me bro hypothetical is leaving out so many components. Specifically, all of the violence that would have potentially taken place either between my team, between settlements, between people in my settlement that wanted my iron deposits, and so many other things that could have potentially existed. I'm just now realizing that this video is basically what it was like to be an entrepreneur in every time period, which I guess makes sense because entrepreneurship and wealth typically go hand in hand. The medieval era. Now things are really heating up and we are in full swing of development. People are settled and civilization is making major strides. There's a very established class system and money is more important than ever. The richest people in the medieval era were the people that were closest to the powers that be, those being the nobility and the merchants that were able to sell products over very long distances. Both of these were extremely useful to the king and therefore paid very nicely. And considering the major wealth gap in the huge centralization of money and power, your best bet was to get money from the king, because most other people just didn't have it. During this time, spices, precious metals, and silk were extremely desirable materials, and I'm going to use those to my advantage once we get to the hypothetical. For my plan to get rich in the medieval era, I want to do something different. I'm done being an entrepreneur. I want to now become a criminal. And for this reason, I'll need to target merchants. You see, the nobility had most of their wealth come from the land that they owned, which was given to them from the monarch. And it's rather hard to steal land, at least not without a fight. So I think I'm better off stealing from the long distance merchants. In this time period, I am more motivated than ever to get my bag up because we are starting to see the early equivalent of modern luxuries. Large, beautiful castles, servants, comfy clothes, something that kind of resembles a toilet, concubines, jewel-encrusted stuff, and other fun stuff like that. So yeah, let's get rich. Although my plan may seem simple, with nations developing and with power becoming centralized, I am at greater risk than ever of being reprimanded for the crimes I'm about to commit. Because now there is rule, there is order, and I need to be very careful about how I go about breaking it. I'll start my journey once again like every other journey as an 18-year-old looking to build my life. Let's say that I was born into an established kingdom, into a regular poor family. My goal is to become a known member of society and a positive one at that. I want to be active in the church, helping those in need, and seen often within the community. But this will work in my favor for my malicious intentions. My goal is to gain the trust specifically of the rich merchants doing long distance trade, because they 1, have the most money, and 2, are the most vulnerable. See, being a thief, I could try to pickpocket around my city, but eventually it's gonna catch up to me. And honestly, there's a cap to how much money I can make. Back to my trust with the merchants. My goal is for them to feel comfortable sharing their information with me, specifically when trade shipments are going out, what the shipments are, and where they are going to be. For example, imagine I just go around the city with a broom every so often, just out of my goodwill, but I always somehow happen to broom where the rich merchants merchants are. This isn't by accident. I want to overhear them, and ideally, I want to gain information. If I'm sweeping right beside two rich merchants having a discussion outside and I overhear one of them telling the other one that they had a large shipment of spices just get delivered and they are currently days away from getting their large payment, I'm going to inquire. I may ask this merchant how the shipment went and where they shipped it and where they even got the spices. I'm going to pretend like I'm interested in the business, when in reality, I just want to know when's that money coming into town and what route is it going to take. Let's just assume that this merchant slips up and he accidentally tells me that his people always come in the back route to the kingdom and they always head home under the veil of night. At that point, I have all of the information I need. I will go about my day, and as soon as the sun starts to set, I will put on my dark cloak and begin my journey. I will begin my trek on the back trail, getting outside of the kingdom and closer to my reward. I'll likely go 10, 20, 30, maybe even 40 kilometers on the trail. Something far enough from my kingdom so nobody knows what's going on, but still not too far that I can't do it in one night. I have two options. I can either hide and sneak attack these people on the way back, or I could gain their attention in other ways. For this example, my strategy is tricking the merchants into stopping and thinking that I need help. I brought a second robe with me and I folded it in a way that made it look like it was a swaddled baby. I'm going to be sitting in the middle of the trail holding my baby, rocking back and forth, hysterically waiting for them. Once they arrive, I'm going to beg them for their help and tell them that they need to help save my baby. I am going to be inconsolable and overwhelming to them. They're going to want to leave me immediately. And fortunately, I don't need much time to distract them. Because the merchant didn't tell me who was carrying the gold and where it was held, pickpocketing here is useless, and my only option is to kill them. Because I have the agility and sword skills of an absolute ninja, I flawlessly cut them all in half and they die instantly. And with my expertly placed slices, the bag of gold and silver instantly reveals itself to me. I grab the loot, leave the men, and head back into my kingdom. I arrive the same night I left, I put my robe away, and in the morning, I start the nice side of my double life. Here's the problem with this situation. If money's going missing all the time and I, a poor person, all of a sudden becomes rich, people are gonna ask questions. So I can't really spend my money, but that's okay. Because once I'm satisfied with the amount of money I have, I can leave my settlement and begin a new life. If I can travel far enough and go to places where I've never been heard of, which is likely the case if I'm just a locally known, gentle, poor person, in any new settlement I go to, I can tell them a rather convincing story that I am a wealthy merchant who was ran out of town by a bad gang and I'm just looking to have a peaceful life somewhere nice. Is this a likely or potentially even realistic situation? I highly doubt it, once again, but I think it's an actually pretty funny hypothetical of one way a rather evil person could get rich in the medieval era. And honestly, I would bet money that something like this happened at least once, and was probably more common than we think. Violence was common, robbery was everywhere, law only really existed inside of castle walls, and people were brutal. So to answer your question, how do you get rich in the medieval era? Well, there's plenty of ways, but if you're not born into money and you're not willing to put in the effort to become a successful merchant, I'd say your best bet is to go all Assassin's Creed and become the best thief you can absolutely be. The early modern era. At this point, we've gone through millions of years of history, and the early modern era is our last stop before the modern day. And the early modern era, although relatively short, is one of the most influential eras of all time, and is where we see the foundation set for the modern world that we live in today, in good ways and bad ways too. In the early modern era, wealth was driven by exploration, trade, and colonization. Nations and individuals who invested in voyages reaped enormous profits from new trade routes and new resources. Merchants are richer than ever, and now the early versions of bankers are also accumulating wealth through the emerging global trade. Like almost every other time period, owning land and engaging in agriculture is still extremely important. But with the continued growth of commerce, finance, and manufacturing, more and more opportunities are beginning to present themselves to, once again, get that bag. So we're in the early modern era. How are we going to get rich? Well, we have two new options, exploration and colonization. And for the sake of my reputation, let's go with exploration. My goal as an explorer is going to be to build the absolute best team of cartographers, navigators, researchers, and writers, so I can not only establish new trade routes, but also make extra money by developing maps and documenting what I'm seeing on my journeys. Because during this point in time, a lot of the world was unmapped and undiscovered, at least to some people. I guess my first step would be to beg the king for a boat and a small loan. This won't be easy, but I'll tell him that I have the best cartographers, the best writers, the best captains, and the best people on my team to make sure that our voyages not only find new lands, but bring back artifacts, establish trade routes with the people that are there, if any, and that the places that we go are documented not only in map form, but in the written word. And if that doesn't convince the king for him to fund my journey, I don't know what will. So in this case, assuming he does, I now have a boat and a small loan of money. But there's one problem. All of those people that I told the king I had on my team, I don't have on my team. And I don't even have a team. So now I gotta get him. And during this time period, where do you think the best and the brightest would be? Do you think they would be the guy sitting on the side of the road drinking wine and ale? Likely not. They're likely in the government where I just got the boat and the loan. Now, of course, I can't ask the king for these people because then he'll know I'm lying. So I have to be a bit more creative. What I'm going to do is I'm going to identify the key players in the government, specifically for captains and cartographers, and I'm gonna go to them and tell them, hey, the king gave me a loan, a boat, and he told me that you have to come with me. Now, of course, he could verify this with the king unless I told him a reason not to. I'm gonna tell these people that the king is mad at them. And I don't know why, but the king said that if he saw them again, he was going to have them executed. And for that reason, these people should come on this adventure with me. Not only to get out of the king's sight for a bit, but also to get back in the king's good graces. This may seem manipulative, and you're 100% right, but it's also, in this situation, my only option. And now, my house of cards is finally complete. And together, we set sail. On this boat, I am more or less useless. So I am trusting the captain and the cartographer with this entire operation, essentially. Fortunately, a lot of areas are simply unmapped. So I just tell the cartographer to tell the captain to go where we haven't gone before. At least where we don't have recorded evidence of going. And from that point, we're off. Even at this point in the story, we've done so much and risked so much just to even get here, and we haven't even made $1 yet, and we are still relatively poor. We have a loaned out ship, a team of people that we're deceiving, and debt to the government in the form of the loan. And if we're unable to find anything of substance, we're cooked. And my elaborate ruse is over. But because everything has kind of perfectly fallen into place in the story, let's continue that trend. And let's say on our first voyage, we discover the most amazing thing ever. What is it, you may ask? It's a remote, abandoned island where the richest pirate gangs hid all of their most valuable loot, including coins, artifacts, booty, and slightly used peg legs. At this point, I need to come clean. I tell the guys, hey, you guys are all being lied to, and if you don't continue the lie with me, then we're all gonna die. The men agree, we get to loot, we go back home, and we do it again and again. And we all live happily ever after. That's just one hypothetical about how you could use exploration to your advantage to get rich in the early modern era. And in case you wanted to learn about how to use colonization to get rich, well, just read a history book. The Modern Era. Wow, guys, can't you believe it? I've been able to cover millions of years of history, and somehow I've made no mistakes and left out no information. Everything I've said has been completely accurate and not totally oversimplified, glossed over, uninformed, and almost entirely hypothetical. That's crazy. But now, here we are in the modern day. A time period you may be familiar with. I don't think I need to explain too much about what being rich in the present day looks like, but I'll give a quick example. If you want a negative example, I recommend going to our channel and watching this video about rich weirdos. But if you want some positive examples, rich people just like cool stuff. Big houses, big boats, fast cars. And if you're really rich, space travel and goth girlfriends. Now, getting into how you can get rich in the present day, the opportunities are honestly endless. If you're currently watching this looking for a way to get rich, I'm gonna give you a foolproof plan to make more money than you could ever even imagine. The first thing you're going to want to do is grow your hair. Get it as long as possible. The next step is to grow facial hair and get tattoos. This will come in handy. After this, you need to establish a wardrobe of white t-shirts and basketball shorts. And once you have the look, you can begin the work. I need you to every single day begin posting on YouTube. Talk about stuff. Talk about stuff you like. Talk about stuff you don't like. Talk about that time you were almost in a movie. Talk about anything. Over time, people are going to respect you, idolize you, love you, and ultimately need your opinion for just about anything. And people are gonna eat this up. And advertisers are gonna wanna sponsor you and put their ads on your video, making you rich. Oh, and now that you have the system of getting rich and the look, you're probably gonna need a name. How about Dry Ineffective or Polar Bear 1? Something along those lines. You guys pick. But in case that's not replicatable for you guys, here's another great idea on how to get rich in the present day. Step 1 is be born into a family where your parents see you more as an opportunity to make money than their flesh and blood. At that point, have parents that create a toy channel based around you. After a few videos of you opening toys that you're excited about, your parents will begin raking in the money. And as you grow up, you'll be like, I had a weird childhood, but my parents are rich. And I think I have money, maybe. And later down the line, we'll see what happens. So yeah, 2 extremely replicatable and honestly foolproof plans on how to get rich in the present day. And ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. A step-by-step plan on how you can get rich in every time period.